Good evening, and welcome to Mike Jesus Langer Presents. Tonight, a shared universe of eyeballs in the midst of a pandemic. The 100-Eyed God series was originally written in mid-2020 as the first round of lockdowns was coming to an end. Some details have aged like fine wine, others like store-bought milk, but all in all, I hope you enjoy this memento from a year that still feels like it hasn't ended. If you want to help me gain the attention of the automated spider god that rules the YouTube algorithm, please comment eyes and like the video. Also, if you want our digital paths to cross again, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell icon. Series videos dropping every Tuesday with new stories coming every Friday. Wash your hands and have a spooky night.
Look, we've all gone a bit crazy this quarantine season. People might be private about it, but we've all had at least one major personal demon sneak up on us and force us to do battle in a confined space. I sincerely hope that you are walking out of this whole experience a bigger, stronger human being. But I fear that for every person that sweats out their issues in solitude, there's going to be someone who let the loneliness and seclusion get to them. Until this morning, George has been quiet. The guy was a perfect roommate. He paid his share of the bills on time, never brought anyone home, and always made sure every dish he touched was clean within the hour. We never really talked much. Even before the world ended, I would bump into him from time to time in the kitchen, and we'd chuck around a pleasantry or two, and then we'd go back to our separate lives. After the lockdown order hit, we had a night when we shared a bottle of wine and complained about the new world we were thrust into, but after that, we went our separate ways. I honestly didn't think about the guy until he started screaming this morning. I spent the 3 months of lockdown in a personal whirlpool of my own. Had one of those need to hit up every ex of mine because I am still in love with them spirals. And while I was riding the carousel of difficult message boxes, I could hear George mutter to himself. I could hear him chipping away at something in the other room, but at the time, I really couldn't care about anything other than whether Sandra Bachman from 7th grade still thinks about me as much as I think about her. Occasionally, I could hear George picking up deliveries from the front door, but aside from his occasional walks through the kitchen, he was stuck in his room, working on arts and crafts. I fought my demons. He fought his. And I figured that after face masks stopped being a legal requirement for leaving the house, we could sit down and share our victories. But he didn't win. I made it. I am a totally balanced person now, even back on Tinder. But George, he didn't win. This morning, I got to see the full scale of his defeat. I was having my wake-up coffee and swiping through potentials when I started hearing stifled screams from his room. Got up to investigate, but before I could reach his door, it burst open and George ran out rambling like a madman, wearing nothing but his coat and underwear. The dude looked and smelled like he didn't shower for weeks. He had bags under his eyes so prominent that you could mistake him for a raccoon. I barely understood what he was yelling. It was something about seeing and understanding now. Something about 100-eyed God. Oh, crazy shit, basically. Kept on waving around some weird wooden statuette in his hands. And kept on screaming louder and louder. And then, as if something inside of him snapped, he dashed out the front door. His room was absolutely filthy. There was an overwhelming smell of sadness, sweat, and rot. I mean, if my head wasn't so stuck on exes during the quarantine, I probably would have smelled it from the kitchen. There were food wrappers everywhere. Plates that seemed to have seen at least 24 meals each in a bunch of plastic bottles filled up with something I don't even want to think about. During our wine talk, George mentioned that he was going to pick up wood carving as a hobby to not occupy himself during the lockdown, but after entering his room, it became obvious that wood carving wasn't a hobby. It was an obsession. The floor was littered with wood shavings. Dull knives and chisels peeked out from beneath the sawdust carpet. The rest of the room was dedicated to the products of his obsession. Small wooden statuettes filled the space. Some were roughly chiseled outlines of human-like creatures, but others were detailed renderings of a man covered in eyeballs. It was as if you could look across the room and trace back a single person's development as a woodcarver. It was almost impressive. If it wasn't for the eerie way all the statues seemed to stare at you. I'm not a snoop. Really, I promise. But when I saw George had left what looked like a journal on his table, I couldn't help myself. I read through the pages and immediately came here. I am not comfortable being locked up in my apartment alone with this knowledge. What I found inside was disturbing. Disturbing enough to anonymously post on the internet.
Day 1 of the lockdown. This is going to be fine. Everyone is freaking out, but this is going to be fine. 2 weeks of being extra careful, and then voila, everything will be back to normal. I'll find a new job, start appreciating the outdoors more, and walk out of quarantine with a brand new set of skills. This is going to be fine. I have a lot of plans for what to do with the next 14 days. I'm putting together an exercise regimen, downloaded a meditation app, and there's a bunch of free online university courses I want to take a peek at. I figured I'd put together a little journal to keep track of my new habits and hold myself accountable for doing stuff every day. I reckon it might turn out to be a pretty cool record of what this whole situation was like. Should be something fun to list through in a decade or two. Although I do have a nagging suspicion that it's not going to be very exciting. I did this many push-ups and meditated today. Spent my whole afternoon learning about ancient Rome. Doesn't make for dramatic entries, but, well, this is going to be fine. I'm going to make good use of my time. Looking forward to writing an entry about my first meditation session tomorrow. Gonna have a drink of wine with a roommate now. She's, having some love life issues. Oh, P.S. Bought some wood and chisels from a hobby store. Gonna try some wood carving later this week. Day 11 of the lockdown. So, that didn't go as planned. Woke up with a mild hangover after the wine talk, so I skipped out of the meditation session, spent the rest of the day watching Netflix, and then the days just blended into one long, sluggish panic attack. I honestly have no concept of time. I didn't know it was Thursday until I started writing this entry. Each moment seems like it's been dragging on for an eternity, but at the same rate, the past 2 weeks have instantaneously disappeared into a black hole. I thought it was just meant to be a really bad case of the flu, but Jesus, the news coverage from the hospitals made me feel sick. Like, literally, I spent the first 4 days legitimately thinking I had the virus, but I'm pretty sure the tightness in my chest is just anxiety. It's nice not requiring a respirator, but that doesn't make any of this easier. I haven't been in a position to do anything for the past 11 days. Can't focus on meditation, don't have enough energy to exercise, and looking at the list of online courses just makes me feel like an idiot. The only thing that can really hold my attention are mind-numbing YouTube videos and Netflix shows, where I can't even remember the names of the leads. I've literally spent the past 2 weeks lying in bed, frying my brain on the computer and being miserable. But this morning, something changed. Religious experience, hallucination, whatever you want to call it. Something happened to me this morning. One moment I was watching a 40-minute documentary on how different types of pasta are made, and the next I was watching myself watching a 40-minute documentary on how different types of pasta are made. It was just as if I was a giant eyeball floating in the middle of the room, looking down at an unshaven mess of a human being lying in his bed. I hovered above the wreck of a man for a couple of seconds until he paused the video. It was as if he knew that I was watching him. He almost looked directly at me before shutting his laptop and getting out of bed. I watched the man stretch, look into the mirror, get sad, and then have some sort of stare-based internal discussion with himself and decide to start unpacking the shopping bags from the arts and crafts store. He sat down at his table with a block of wood and a chisel and started carving away. As soon as that chisel touched the wood, I was back in my own skin, yet even though I was seeing the world through my own eyes, my hands felt foreign, as if they were working under instructions from a source outside of myself. I worked at the wood for about an hour. All the way through, I felt a strange wave of calm wash over me, as if I was doing something right, as if I was doing something I was meant to do. As I write this entry, I have a weird, man-shaped block of wood on my table. It's all sorts of janky. The left arm is significantly longer than the right, and the statuette barely stands on its own, and I'm pretty sure if I touched it, I'd recoil with a handful of splinters, but, well, I feel a sense of pride. It's a good start. It's a good start, but I can do better. Day 12 of the lockdown. Guess who's been productive? Me. I managed to carve out 2 more statuettes before going to sleep last night, and I just finished off my 5th one for the day. There isn't a huge improvement in the quality, but at least the arms are starting to look the same length, so that's nice. Regardless of the craftsmanship, though, I'm just happy to be doing something. Filling my days with wood carving has definitely made the stress of the outside world die down. I haven't checked the news a single time, and outside of having to listen to my roommate get into a weird shouting phone call with her ex, I've spent the whole day inside of my own little wooden world. I mean, it's just nice to make stuff, you know. When I sit down with that chisel, I just get to kind of zone out and let something else work through me. It's as if my brain takes a back seat and my hands do all the thinking. Honestly, I wish I'd started this ages ago. It's great stress relief. I am a bit worried about where I'm going to get more wood to work with. Honestly, wasn't expecting for the quarantine to be extended by another 2 weeks, but here's to hoping that I can find some arts and crafts store that does deliveries. Well, I should go to sleep. It's 3 in the morning and I will, but I feel like I still might have a statuette or 2 left in me. Day 14 of the lockdown. Yeah, sorry for the gap in journal entries, future George. Yesterday just completely got away from me. I didn't write a journal entry, I barely ate, but I did manage to carve out a whole 8 figurines. Oh, they're really taking on a proper shape now. The statuettes are basically little wooden guys with a dotted pattern over their body. With each one I carve, the skin gets less splintery and the pattern gets a bit more pronounced. I thought about carving out something else, took a stab at putting together a dog, but I just ended up making another woodman again. Guess inspiration isn't something you can negotiate with. I am on my last block of wood, though, which is giving me a considerable amount of anxiety. I'm scared that as soon as I don't have a passion project to pour myself into, I'll go back to watching documentaries about pasta and waste whole weeks of my life like I did at the start of the quarantine. Tomorrow, I'm going to take a look around online if there's a way to get wood delivered to the apartment. But for now, I'll just carve away a couple more statuettes and hope that Amazon has my back. Day 15 of the lockdown. It happened again. Last night I carved out 2 more statuettes with the wood that was left, and then I tried going to sleep. I spent the whole night in bed drifting between shapeless thoughts, going from global fears of a major economic recession to more local fears of me losing my mind without something to occupy my hands. The longer I lay there, the more my thoughts hovered towards the wood. I knew that making the figurines filled me with a sense of purpose, as if I was serving a higher power, as if whenever I grabbed that chisel, something else took control of me and willed things into existence by speaking through my hands. Well, if I wasn't able to carve, if I wasn't able to be a conduit for something bigger, I'd just go back to being the person I was at the start of the quarantine. There was only so many more pasta documentaries my mind could handle. I lay there, staring at my wall, stuck in uncertainty as the room grew progressively brighter and the birds started to chirp outside. And then it happened again. I was back in the center of the room watching myself lie in bed, but this time I wasn't alone in my observation. The wooden statuettes, as rugged as their craftsmanship was, were watching the bedraggled man with me. That circular pattern on their skin bloated up into splinter-covered eyeballs. Even though I knew they were made of wood, even though I knew that there was no way for them to be alive, they jittered with an organic wetness, a stare of stifled fascination. We watched as the disheveled man in the bed got up and walked out of his room. He walked through the kitchen and towards the front door. I tried to follow him, but he walked much faster than I could float. Before I could even get out of the room, the man had opened the front door, retrieved something, closed the door, and dragged his bounty back into the bedroom. A black garbage bag, its contents so heavy that the plastic looked like it would snap at any moment. Yet the man dragged it to the table with resigned effort. Wood. Chunks of roughly chopped wood littered over the floor. I watched myself pick up one of the rugged blocks, place it on the table, and raise my chisel. I was back in my own skin, chipping away at the wood as if it was just another one of the store-bought chunks. Yet as my hands worked under the invisible force, my mind started to feel affected as well. I was inside of my own body, but it was as if my senses were being fed glimpses of another place through a metaphysical coffee filter. The calming smell of a forest wet with dew mixed in with the putrid notes of rotting fish, the tranquil touch of a warm summer wind intertwined with that oppressive air that lingers before a fight. I could hear strained, pleading whispers that spoke to a booming, powerful voice. As I worked away at the wood, I was transported somewhere else. With each statuette I produced, the sensations of this foreign place became stronger and stronger. Yet as discomforting as the odd glimpses were, there was an odd calmness resting beneath the strange sensations. It was as if I was doing something right with all this carving, as if the glimpses of that other place were promises of my future. It's as if I was working towards a greater calling. I still have some energy left in me. Time to carve some more. Day 18 of the lockdown. There are 40 statuettes now. The torso and limbs of the figure are pretty much flawless, yet the heads have started to grow strange. It's as if the pattern from the body has migrated to the head and created a meaty, bulbous mass where the skull should be. I need to make more. I know that with each figurine I get better. I know that with each figurine I get closer to what I'm destined to create. I haven't been sleeping well, or eating well, or doing anything other than wood carving well, but I know that there's a destination I'm moving towards. The more I carve, the better I feel. The closer I feel to that ephemeral place whose sensations dance on my skin, I know there's someone there waiting for me. He wants me to carve more. He demands I carve more. Day 25 of the lockdown. Every morning I wake to find myself retrieving another garbage bag. Every morning I carve. I carve, and he speaks to me. It's an implacable whisper, but it calms my fears. It eases my confusion. He tells me I'm working toward perfection. He tells me that he can see me. He tells me I can work harder, create more, be with him sooner. I will make him proud. The bulbous mass at the top of the statuette's heads become more refined into individual spheres, into individual eyes. I'm bringing something to life. I'm allowing him safe passage into our realm. He can see me with his 100 eyes. He can see when I'm wasting time writing these sentimental journal entries. I am part of something bigger. I am the carpenter of the 100-Eye God. I cannot waste time. Day 32 of the lockdown. He can see me. He can see the work. I've made what he demanded. He can see me. He can see the work. The whispered secrets that he's delivered to me will become booming truths and set the world ablaze. He can see me. He can see the work. The time of reckoning is at hand. He can see me. He can see the work. There are others. They all gather where the air smells of trees and dead fish. He can see me. He can see the work. The time has come. He can see me. He can see the work. He can see me. He can see the work. He can see me. He can...
Looks like his pencil tore through the journal here. If my timing is right, that was the last entry George wrote before running out of the house in his underwear and coat. I honestly don't know what to make of this. I've read through the journal trying to figure out, whether there was a point when I could have intervened. Whether there was a moment when George and me could have grabbed another wine and hashed everything out. I hope he's okay. I hope he comes back home and we can talk about it all, but, I have my doubts. It's evening now. With all the smog gone, I can actually see the stars shine from my balcony. For most of the lockdown, I've spent my evenings with a glass of wine, looking up at the beautiful starry sky, wondering whether Sandra Bachman is looking at the same thing. But, tonight is different. Tonight, I'm not thinking about Sandra Bachman, partially because I am totally over her, but mainly because there's something in the air. Oppressive electricity lingers in the wind. It's as if we are all just silently counting down to a disaster. You can see the dog walkers nervously pick at their face masks. The cars are barely stopping at red lights. And everyone is trying to get home as soon as possible. Something feels undeniably wrong. The stars are not romantic jewels that make you think about past loves tonight. They are eyes. 1,000 blank eyes staring down at us. Waiting.
Somewhere out there, in the gentle summer night, there's a pair of love-struck teens lying in a meadow. They've spent the whole day talking about how much they've missed each other, about how confusing the whole pandemic business was, and about how, for a second, it seemed that the world was going to end. But now, conversation has run out. All they have left is the warmth of each other's bodies. "Stars are beautiful tonight," she says. "They're just far-off explosions that happened millions of years ago, and the light hasn't reached us yet," he replies, making his voice deeper than it is, hoping that he sounds smarter and more attractive that way. "They are beautiful, though," he adds, holding her tight. He's wrong. The things that shine above us tonight are not the result of some impersonal cosmic force light years away. Tonight, the sky is a smattering of silver eyeballs. He's watching us, waiting to see whether we are ready for his arrival. billions of people around the world are breathing a controlled sigh of relief. They keep on asking each other in hushed voices whether the world will slowly start returning back to its old shape, whether we will have crossed our collective rough patch, whether life will go back to normal. It won't. After tonight, things will never be the same. When he walks our streets, they will weep, they will rage, they will despair, but once the dust settles, they will submit. They are not prepared for his arrival. They are not prepared for the judgment and force that will rain from the sky directly into each puny mortal soul. But I am. I have a carrot cake made with my sweat, blood, and tears to prove it. Tonight, the 100-eye God will feast on my offering. Moving to the capital wasn't a decision that I made lightly. The life I had back in my dusty town was nothing to scoff at. It was a peaceful existence filled with uncomplicated bar work, aged friendships, and the occasional lover that I liked. But it wasn't enough. I knew that if I didn't get out while I still could, I would end up getting knocked up and nailed down to an existence of watching trains rumble through the capital. No one thought I would actually do it. The grizzled old man at the pub would laugh, say that leaving town was a mistake, that the city was no place for a girl like me, that I should stay at home and away from all the foreign filth that had seeped into the streets of the capital. Those that would share my bed would take my plans to leave personally, as if me wanting to taste the world outside of our dead in town was an affront to their masculinity, as if me wanting to leave meant that I didn't love them as much as they loved me. And I guess they were right. After the inevitable argument, after the forced peace, it was always difficult to sleep. As I lay on the edge of that uncomfortable mattress, all that I could hear was the far-off thumping of trains heading towards the promised land. Somewhere out in the darkness was a bright city, a place where people from all across the world rubbed shoulders and spoke of home, a place where poets and artists and musicians schemed works of magnificence that would take the planet by storm, a place where I could feel whole. When the stroke of midnight forced the planet into a new decade, I made the decision. I was going to take the leap. The Austro-Hungarian Empire died a shameful death in the early 20th century, but its ghost still haunts the governmental offices of the capital into this day. In the eyes of every bureaucrat lingers a bit of that famous disdain for human life which made Kafka put a pen to paper. The first couple of weeks in the capital were spent running around offices figuring out the details of my health insurance, of my transit card, of my new permanent address. Each soulless face that hid behind plexiglass made me feel smaller and smaller, until I felt like I barely existed at all. Yet I knew that if I made it through the paperwork, if I endured those never-ending hallways, I would end up being a permanent resident in a city that bustled with life. My permanent address was changed to an apartment in the old Soviet housing projects. I was set to start working in the bar at one of those tourist traps that turn our culture into a sellable, authentic experience. I had my transport card and my health insurance and everything else I needed. Every morning I would count down the days to the film screenings, to the language exchanges, to the lectures held in dusty basements that I so craved to be a part of. And just when it seemed like the life I had dreamed of for years was within the grasp of my fingers, the face masks appeared. At first, it was a curiosity on the subway. Among the crowds of bodies, you would see someone with cloth over their face and think, wow, here's someone who's scared. But that fear spread. Before they became obligatory, they became common. Every day on my way to work, I would see more and more people with that baby blue mask. The customers at the bar started to dwindle. At first, my coworkers laughed about how unpredictable the tourist rushes are, but soon enough, a pattern emerged. Soon enough, the bar cut its prices in half to cater to the locals. Soon enough, the bar closed down. The rice, the pasta, the canned goods, every bit of non-perishable food disappeared from the stores. A palpable panic drifted through the streets. We all locked ourselves at home. Fearing the microscopic specter that plagued the outside world, we watched the news conferences. We were told to stay home. The first couple days of lockdown were spent in a daze. None of it seemed real. Back home, back in what fragile house by the train tracks, I remember watching the experts on the television talking about economics and foreign policy with breathtaking confidence. They knew what was happening. The world would move in a few select paths that could be predicted with the right knowledge, and they had the right knowledge. When I was a kid, I yearned to be like them, to be able to stand in front of a nation and speak with assuredness about facts and theories. Yet, as the panic and the pandemic hit, that illusion of intelligence and courage quickly disappeared. The same men and women that puffed up their chests and talked about statistics now mumble through the cloth over their face about how unprecedented the situation was. I kept on telling myself that I was not under any existential threat. I was young and thus safe from the virus. I might have lost my job, but the stimulus checks would keep me afloat. I was going to make it through. Yet the more I assured myself of my personal safety, the more I realized that the thought of danger wasn't what was keeping me awake at night. I was going to make it through, yes, but I was going to make it through alone. My only tie to anything remotely social was my newsfeed. Back home, people were sitting around bonfires, relishing the safety of the countryside. The pub that I had worked at was officially closed, but still in full swing. Every couple I knew was publicly declaring how happy they were to be stuck together. Some posted words of kindness. Some talked about how they are there for anyone who needs to talk. But all the conversations I had through the text boxes were hollow. These people had lives. I didn't. I was stuck in a cramped room on the top floor of a totalitarian housing block. After the initial shock of the lockdown wore off, I spent every waking moment lamenting how alone I was. The neighbor made everything so much worse. I had only seen her once before. She jumped into the elevator just as the doors were closing. She wore a blue hoodie commemorating her high school graduation. We were the same year. We were both from towns that you'd have to work to find on a map. I was going to talk to her, say hello as a fellow country bumpkin, and try to make my first friend in the city. But she was on her phone. She was crying in the midst of an argument so heated that an elevator ride with a stranger wouldn't put it on pause. She knew he was seeing other people. She knew he thought she wasn't good enough. She would never forgive him. But she did. She forgave him loudly on a regular basis. She forgave him so loudly that the mirror on our shared wall would shake whenever she was absolving him of his sins. She was being louder for him, letting him know that they had something special going this quarantine season, something that would continue after the world got back to normal. Within a week of lockdown measures, I had a new neighbor. The sex was loud and obnoxious, but what was so much worse was the pillow talk. After the screaming was done, all I could hear were his tenor murmurs on the other side of the wall. He'd speak, his words coming through my wall like a low, droning rumble. She would punctuate his senseless babblings with high-pitched, laughing yelps. She was laughing harder than she had to. But then again, she had her reasons. It was during one of those post-coital laughter lectures that I first heard him. I was lying on the couch, my hands covering my eyes, trying to get a grip. By then, my loneliness had manifested itself into a tactile mental mark. I could feel my mind growing sluggish and dark, with snapshots of home, of friends, of past loves. I could see the couple in the other room, naked and breathless, keeping each other company. All of those images just kept on repeating with dizzying force. My chest ached with the need to speak to someone, to connect, to feel like a real human being.
Bake a carrot cake.
Suddenly, all of the lonely wheels spinning in my head screeched to a halt. There was a single distinct voice in my head.
Bake a carrot cake and you will feel better.
I sat up, trying to figure out if the thought was my own or if it was being forced into my head. For a second, all I could hear was my neighbor's forced screeching laughter, but then, in a whisper, the thought came back.
Bake a carrot cake.
The thought of baking seemed absurd. But with that voice in the back of my head, the loneliness that was tearing away at me just seconds ago became nothing but a light annoyance. I thumbed out an inquiry for a recipe on my phone. I had sugar, I had flour, I had eggs, and there was a handful of sad carrots nearing the end of their life rolling around the back of my fridge.
Bake a carrot cake.
The voice whispered as I heated the oven. When I was 8, I went through a phase where I thought cooking was the neatest thing. Every Saturday morning, my mom would let me trail her in the kitchen and help out in whatever way my grubby 8-year-old hands could. My cooking career didn't last long, though. One Saturday, my mother decided I was skilled enough to cut vegetables. I wasn't. It wasn't a big cut, but as I sucked in my finger, my excitement for the Saturday kitchen adventures disappeared. A couple weeks later, while the parents were out at a dinner party, I decided I'd seen enough cooking shows to make French toast on my own. I hadn't. I somehow managed to give myself severe food poisoning. That put an end to my interest in cooking. Yet, as I grated away at the rubbery carrots that probably belonged in the trash, all of my cooking-related trauma took a back seat. It felt good to be doing something. All of a sudden, I wasn't some social reject clawing at her face on a couch. I was a woman with a goal. I was a chef.
Careful about your fingers. Graters are among the most common source of kitchen injury.
My mind whispered. I mixed the ingredients, piled the weird gray sludge into a baking tray, and hoped for the best. The kitchen filled with the smell of carrots and too much egg.
This carrot cake will not be good.
The voice spoke with a bit more strength this time.
And neither will the next one or the one after that. But you must keep on baking. You must keep on improving. For when the day comes, his eye shall fall upon your creation in judgment.
Ding! I took out the cake. Didn't wait for it to cool down and burnt my tongue with a tasteless mistake. The voice was right. The carrot cake I had made was the equivalent of eating polystyrene covered in expired carrot juice. But it felt good to have made something. I knew I could do better. I knew I would do better. My neighbors were starting off another round of forgiveness, but I had my face mask on and was out the door before the mirror started to shake. The grocery store was filled with improvised face coverings and fearful eyes. People were picking up a year's worth of pasta, a couple years' worth of rice, lifetime supplies of toilet paper stacked like a misguided Tower of Babel, swayed from side to side in the carts of the most paranoid-looking shoppers. Yet the produce remained plentiful. I picked out some healthy-looking carrots, a variety of spices, and another bag of flour. Everything seemed simple enough until I reached the checkout. Back home, at the pub where I worked, the jukebox barely worked, and even when it did, it refused to play anything other than Frank Sinatra and hits from the communist era. I didn't know self-checkout machines were a common thing until I moved to the city, and even then I would always prefer to stand in line to make eye contact with a stranger. During the pandemic, that choice was taken away. The machine refused to weigh my carrots, then it misidentified them as watermelons. Then it informed me that I had scanned in enough carrots to afford 2 months' worth of rent. I struggled with the machine for what felt like an eternity. Then something snapped in me. I was in a city where I didn't know anyone, trying to negotiate carrot prices with a robot. I was going crazy. Back home, all my friends were gearing up for a drunken bonfire, and I was stuck under sad fluorescent lighting.
Stop it!
The voice commanded, as my eyes welled up.
This is just another thing you have to master in order to satisfy him. You will learn how to operate this cursed machine, and you will deliver a sacrifice worthy of his gaze.
Who is he? I said out loud. The screen of the self-checkout went dark. All I could see was my own reflection. All I could see were my watery eyes.
Bake a carrot cake and you will feel better.
The voice suggested. I started scanning my groceries again. It took effort, but eventually I walked out with a bag full of carrot cake ingredients. Time in isolation doesn't behave like normal time. When it is observed in drags with sluggish impossibility, yet when one looks back, it seems as if it had passed instantaneously. One moment you are staring at the clock, waiting for a single cursed minute to pass, but then snap! It's 3 months later, and all you have to remember the past by are blurry flashes of activity. My 3 months in lockup were one long stay in the kitchen. At first, the murmurs and moans and shrieks of my neighbors bothered me, but soon enough, they were drowned out by my own company. As long as I was grating the carrots, as long as I was mixing the icing, as long as I was baking, the voice was there.
Did you know that carrots were first discovered in what is modern-day Afghanistan 5,000 years ago?
As I worked in the kitchen, the voice would whisper truths into my ear with a soft rumble.
Did you know that carrots have the same consistency as a human finger? Did you know that the carrots were not usually orange until the 17th century? Did you know that carrots are over 87% water?
My first carrot cake wasn't good. My second cake wasn't good. My third cake wasn't good, and the trend continued. Yet with every finished dish, my chest swelled with pride. I was getting closer. With every twist to the recipe, with every experimental spice thrown in, I was getting closer to an offering that I could bring him.
Did you know that the myth that carrots improve your sight was perpetuated during the Second World War to hide the fact that the British Royal Air Force developed night radars? Did you know that carrots have the same consistency as a human finger? You can bite them right off. Did you know that a teaspoon can hold 2,000 carrot seeds?
The voice became a steady companion. I looked forward to hearing the smooth rumble every day, every moment that I could spare.
Did you know that carrots have the same consistency as a human finger? You can bite them right off. Did you know that a single carrot, can give you enough energy to walk a mile?
My 20th carrot cake tasted delicious. My 25th was godly, yet there was still something missing, something that was not good enough. After countless trips to the fluorescent-lit supermarket, after I mastered the self-checkout machine and could grab all of my ingredients with closed eyes, I stopped. The trips were too long, the produce too unpredictable. I could not spend half my days collecting ingredients across town. I started shopping online, finding the most exotic of spices, the most exquisite of carrots. One day I woke up to a blender being delivered to my apartment. I didn't remember ordering it, but my grater was blunted enough to warrant it. The next round of carrot cakes were smoother than ever, and yet there was still something missing. I continued experimenting with the recipe. I threw in pinches of ginger, teaspoons of vanilla extract, canned pineapples, and the voice kept on whispering,
Did you know that carrots are a good source of fiber? Did you know carrots have the same consistency as human fingers? You can bite them right off. Try it.
Yet it wasn't just carrot-related facts that the voice whispered to soothe my lonely soul. The voice spoke of him. He was near. Soon enough, he would walk the land to deliver his judgment. He was watching, waiting for the moment to lumber through our mortal realm. My offering had to be perfect. He would not accept anything less. And my carrot cake was not perfect, yet.
Did you know carrots have the same consistency as a human finger? You can bite it right off. Try it.
I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I was staring at a stranger whose unwashed teeth were filled with traces of that orange treat, whose hair was matted with remnants of flour and egg and icing, a stranger with nails uncut for months. The various sweet messes from the kitchen had gathered beneath my nails to make a sick, thick layer of black grime.
Try it!
I put my dirty pointer finger in my mouth and bit down as hard as I could. A lightning bolt of agony, a spritz of iron in my icing-covered mouth. The bite caused me horrific pain, but the finger was still attached. A carrot does not have the same consistency as a human finger.
Do not give up. You are so close to perfection. The 100-Eye God requires true sacrifice from those who serve him. He is watching. Do not disappoint him.
I put my finger back in my mouth. Over the months, I had forgotten the sound of my own voice. The whisper in my head had become so ingrained in my internal monologue that I considered it a part of myself. My own vocal cords had become a distant memory. Removing my finger reminded me of what I sound like. As I screamed, my hands worked independently of my mind. They turned on the gas burner. They heated up a butter knife. They cauterized the wound. I collapsed on the flour-covered floor of my kitchen.
He can see you. He has seen the work. All you need to do is finish off the recipe.
I put another finger in my mouth.
He can see you. He has seen the work. His eyes have followed your journey.
I put another finger in the blender.
He can see you. He has seen the work. He will not spare you if you turn away now.
Another helping of blood slipped down my throat.
He can see you. He has seen the work. You will never be alone again.
I put another finger in the blender.
He can see you. He has seen the work. You will never be alone again.
I put another finger in the blender.
He can see.
A knock. I found myself standing in the middle of my kitchen, 3 dirty fingers in the blender, and someone knocking at my door. I hid my hand behind my apron and made my way to the door. Hey, was that you screaming just now? She stood there in her hoodie and shorts, a concerned smile on her face. No, I replied. Probably a different neighbor, I added in hopes of making her leave. Oh, okay, well, she extended her hand. I'm Alice. Can't believe we've lived next to each other and never met. I could imagine us having wine together. We could sit in my living room, burn through a bottle, and talk about how insane the whole pandemic was, about how weird self-checkout machines are, about how strange it is living in the capital after growing up in the middle of nowhere. I could warn her about how men who cheat once tend to cheat in perpetuity. She could take me to parties and introduce me to people. We could have been friends. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't shake that hand. Stop having such loud sex! Everyone can hear you! I hear myself say before I slam the door with my stub of a hand. The 100-Eyed God is the only company I need now! I went back to the blender. I had not tasted this carrot cake, but I know it is exactly what he wants. Tonight, I will meet him, and I will not be alone. I know that all across the city, all across the villages and towns, there are others like me, men and women who have heard the call, who have heard the whispers and followed them to their inevitable end. Tonight we will all meet. Tonight we will meet beneath those shining eyes in the sky. Somewhere out there in the gentle summer night, there's a pair of love-struck teens lying in a meadow. They talk of the stars as if they were beautiful, as if they were far-off lights from explosions a million years in the past, but they are wrong. Those stars are eyes, and they are watching us. They are waiting for the arrival of the 100-Eye God.
There are places out there in the world that are special. Places that feel just a twinge more real than the rest. Spots on the planet where the smells, the wind, the light all jumble together into one steady stream of cosmic calm that allows you to block out the chaos of the outside world. My pond was one of those places. It wasn't really a pond. It was an old man-made reservoir in the middle of the woods back from the communist era. But if I didn't tell you, you probably wouldn't know. Reeds grew on the edge of the bank, and schools of fish squirmed through the water, and the pond was tucked away in the middle of a forest. The reservoir, or pond, or whatever you want to call it, was my calm little center of the universe. I was a young man when I first stumbled upon that magical place. Russian tanks had just rolled in through the borders to provide brotherly assistance against our attempts to democratize the country. Everyone was either plotting harebrained revolutions against a superpower or lamenting the death of a movement that never really began. I didn't want to think about the uncertain future. I didn't want to fight a war I couldn't win. I just wanted a break. So I walked. I walked out of my crummy apartment, out of the anxious city, past construction sites for those concrete monstrosities that would adorn the edges of our capital, and into the quiet forest. And in the midst of an anxiety-riddled walk, I stumbled into my own personal slice of heaven. Suddenly, I wasn't in a country that was being stomped on by Stalin's de-Stalinized legacy. I wasn't worrying about how unclear the horizons of my life were. I wasn't anxious anymore. I was just standing by a pond on a warm September day. And in that moment, a moment that flowed seamlessly until sundown, I knew that I could find happiness in the gentle serenity of the pond. There was a run-down wooden cottage right next to the concrete control room of the reservoir, and I knew I had to have it. It took nearly a decade of work. Paychecks in totalitarian states are barely enough to survive on, and the concept of private ownership without family contacts tends to be a bit hairy. But with enough effort and a helping of palm grease, I reached my goal. I became the sole owner of the wooden cottage. The pond would be a steady, soothing balm on my soul whenever life out in the real world got too difficult to manage. Now, I would get visitors every couple of years, men who carried no badges but spoke with this authority of someone who performs disappearance magic tricks. They asked me about my political views, about whether I had any connections to capitalist imperialists who might be interested in tainting our great nation's water supplies, and a variety of other nonsense that only a state security agent would ask about. I kept my head low, no information, no affiliation, no plans. And over the years, they found problems bigger than me. Human rights were violated, charters were signed, protesters were beaten, and finally the regime fell. I celebrated that democratic plot from my youth coming into fruition by working a couple of more years at my day job and then retiring to live in my little cabin in the woods. I've never been one for fishing, but an afternoon thought about the pond being overpopulated manifested itself into a fishing rod purchase a couple of weeks later. Fishing then became a part of the charm of the place. I'd just lean back on the grass, grab a beer, and grow old waiting for something to nibble on the bait. The 90s were very kind to me, but then the joggers came. The city was starting to expand. Past the concrete monstrosities of the Soviet-era housing projects, new, shiny pieces of equally jarring modern architecture started to grow. They all somehow managed to use the English word living in their names or carried some vaguely Italian moniker. The people that lived in the newly constructed homes came over to my pond to jog, to walk their annoying dogs, to barbecue. There was even talk of opening a waterside pub next to the pond. I tolerated them for years. If there weren't any children around and the dogs kept their distance and the joggers weren't wheezing like idiots, I could have my peace. But then they all disappeared. I am a cynical old man, but I wouldn't celebrate a global health crisis. I will, however, say that I didn't mind the newfound peace that the pandemic brought to me. Every couple of days, youth volunteers would come and drop off some supplies for me as part of this senior aid program, and all I had to do was not come into contact with them. It didn't take long for me to get used to my new role of a face mask wearing hermit, and if things had stayed the same, I wouldn't have anything to complain about. But they didn't. It happened around 2 weeks after the lockdown measures were announced. I was just sitting on the riverbank enjoying the gentle chirping of the far-off birds, watching the water shimmer in the autumn breeze, and then I felt it. An almost palpable rush of energy went through my head as if something was squirming around my brain looking for a sensitive nerve. Questions started drifting through my mind. Has anyone ever truly seen me as a human being? What will I leave behind for future generations to look at? Am I ready to come eye to eye with death, or do I have regrets? I could see doors, 100 locked doors that could have led to a family, to a legacy, to a life that the pond couldn't offer. I stubbed out the idea as soon as it reared its horns. I'm pushing 80, I wasn't going to waste my time on things I couldn't do anything about. The line tightened. I grabbed my rod and started reeling. The catch ended up being a pathetic little thing. After watching it flop on the line for a bit, I took it off the hook and chucked it back into the water. For a couple of minutes, I just sat there, enjoying the warmth of the sun, taking in the smell of the forest, when I suddenly heard the voice.
Get out!
It said, ringing through my head. There was a weak screechiness to it, as if whatever power was beaming it into my head was struggling.
The 100-eyed god compels you to leave.
No, I said out loud.
You will leave this place. You have been warned.
The voice whispered. Well, this is probably what going senile feels like, I thought to myself, and continued to lay on the grass. Sure, knowing that my mind was going was not a pleasant thought, but being by that peaceful water soothed those worried thoughts out of my head. What will be, I thought. As long as I have my pond, I am content. Then, my pond started to fade away. I don't know exactly when I noticed it. You see, life after retirement has been just one long fishing trip for me. But it must have been within the same week of hearing that voice in my head. The voice didn't come back, but something about the pond had changed. It was still as calm as ever, but something was wrong about it. Instead of floating thoughtlessly in the serene energy of the water, I was constantly searching for that one thing that was unusual, for the thing that was missing. I walked through the tree line and found a couple of stumps. It looked as if someone had chopped down a handful of trees while I was sleeping, but it didn't really bother me none. We were in the middle of a forest. There were plenty of trees. The missing wood wasn't what was troubling me. There was something wrong about the pond itself. I was in the middle of reeling in a fish. This was a big one, probably one of those grossly oversized carp that tend to get hungry for hooks around autumn. Yet as I stood up with the rod to get a better grip, I noticed something. There was a large amount of mud at the edge of the water. The pond was being drained. Someone was trying to bleed out my paradise. When I first bought the cottage, the concrete shack that held the controls to the reservoir was just that, a faceless slab of concrete that no one touched. During the revolution, a couple of kids that weren't brave enough to spray paint things in front of the riot police came out to the reservoir and wrote various slogans on the concrete chunk. "Love and truth shall be victorious," the scribbles read 30 years later. Beneath them was a banged-up metal door. It was open, but it wasn't meant to be open. There was dust all over the floor. The footsteps were easy to follow. They led directly towards the main water valve. Someone had been tampering with the drainage of the pond. The valve was rusty as all hell, but with a tired creak, it returned back to its position.
"You're going against the wishes of the hundred-eyed god. He can see you, he will not forget you."
I shook the croaking senility out of my head. A sense of calm washed over me. With the valves turned back to where they were meant to be, the pond was safe. I sat down by the pond and watched the stars twinkle their way out of the sunset. The world around me radiated with a serene tranquility. For a moment, out there in the dark, it seemed like things would go back to normal, like I would resume my lonesome life by the pond. That was the last time I felt true peace. Sunken eyes, wheezing breaths, and sweat-covered bodies. They slowly trickled into my little kingdom. At first, I thought they were just regular joggers. People who had spent the March Madness hiding at home and felt a need to get back out on the trails in April. But these people didn't look like regular joggers. They looked more like the people who'd stand next to the grill during barbecues. The people who would make loud conversation about meat. The sort of people who always got just a twinge bit too drunk. The people who had the body proportions of someone who really likes food. Yet as they beat their feet against the jogging trail, their chubby cheeriness was gone. These people were suffering, drenched in their own perspiration, grasping at breaths their body unwilling to give. They were pushing themselves past the limits of their rotund bodies, yet every day they showed, every day they grew more numerous. I tried to focus on my fishing. I tried to ignore what was happening behind my back and just mind my own business, but whenever I was on the edge of slipping back into the soothing spirit of the pond, these moist sweatpants-wearing figures would drag my attention away. Usually they simply ran around the pond. Sometimes they carried axes out into the forest. Sometimes they would emerge with weighed-down garbage bags slumped across their shoulders. Regardless of what they were doing, however, they kept their eyes locked on me. Those cursed runners were watching me.
"Wow, this is a chill spot."
A voice next to me casually remarked. For a split second, I thought that it was just my mind playing tricks on me again, but it wasn't. A couple meters away from me was a girl who couldn't have been more than 17. She had her face mask pulled down to her chin so that she could puff on her hand-rolled cigarette. Her green eyes burrowed into me. "Yeah," I grunted, looking for a way out of the conversation. Talking to teens is always trouble, but the absurdity of the joggers got to me. "You know what all these sweaty people want?" I asked. A wheezing man stumbled by us with a heavy garbage bag over his back.
"I don't know,"
she said, puffing away on her cigarette.
"One of them is my stepdad. He's really dopey. Think it's a cult or something."
The smoke drifted towards me. It wasn't a cigarette. I could smell the 60s in the air.
"You want a hit?"
No. I grunted and turned back to the water. The last thing I wanted to become entangled in someone else's family drama. Yet as I watched the bank of the pond, I noticed something. The reeds were fully out of the water. The reservoir was being drained again. "Have you been messing with the water valves?" I asked the teen, but she was gone. The smell of her joint still lingered, But aside from the sweating joggers, I was alone. I went towards the concrete shack. This time, it wasn't empty. The man turned around as soon as I entered the valve room. His eyes were sunk deep into his skull. His loose clothes draped on him like wet blankets. An expression of fear danced in his eyes. He was clearly unwell. "Why are you messing with the water valves? You're gonna kill the fish," I said.
You have been warned.
As he spoke, his voice shook. He sounded weak, scared, but as he talked, there were echoes in my mind of another voice. A powerful voice, a roaring thunder between my ears.
The hundred-eyed god demands you leave this place.
"What did the pond ever do to you?" I asked.
You have been warned. Leave this place.
The man approached me, his fists shaking. Outside, the pounding of the feet stopped. Pained wheezing echoed through the meadow. As I backed out of the room, I could see all the other joggers had stopped. They were all staring at me.
Never come back. The hundred-eyed god commands this.
The man said to the backing of that infernal voice. As he walked towards me, he started to swing his fists. His eyes followed each attempted punch with regret, as if he was the world's most resentful marionette puppet. I just kept backing up, hoping he would calm down. I should have spent more time looking under my feet. I slipped. I tumbled down towards my slice of paradise. The soft ground that I laid in for years hit my head like a brick. I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital with a fractured skull. Apparently, someone called an ambulance after they'd found me sprawled out before the entrance to the Ochita living complex. The hazmat-looking nurses told me I was lucky. At my age, most head injuries were fatal. The hospital would keep me around for the evening, and then I would be free to go back to my cottage. I don't know how my body ended up so far away from the pond. I don't know what those strange joggers wanted. I don't know whether that voice that I heard in my head was a product of my senility or something much darker. The only thing that I know with complete certainty is that there's something wrong with my pond. There's an untraceable pain in my chest, as if something that I loved has died, as if my call to being has been wiped from existence. I hope that I'm wrong, but a shimmer in my heart tells me my pond has been turned into something much less peaceful. As I sit here writing this post, I'm trying to stay calm, trying to remember how it felt to sit by those reeds and let life pass me by. But instead, I keep on drifting over to the window. Even with the city's bright lights bleeding out into the sky, I can see the stars. There are thousands of them, shining brighter than they ever were before. Out there in the forest by my pond, they must be so much brighter. It's as if the stars are waiting for something, as if they are 1,000 sentient eyes, watching us.
It's been 3 months since I've touched my wife. She spent the entirety of the pandemic living in the city with her sister, so that it would be easier for her to commute to the hospital. And now, with case numbers safely in the low 2-digit territory, she is snoring gently on my chest. I wish I could fall asleep next to her, that I could let my tired, aching body rest and wake up to a world returning back to normal. But I can't. I know I did something wrong. I'm not completely certain of what I did. The memory of the past 3 months is an ungraspable fog that floats around my mind, but I know I've set in motion incomprehensible forces. Outside, the stars shine like 1,000 curious eyes waiting, watching to see how everything in our puny mortal realm will play out, and I know that I've been a small, sweaty puzzle piece in the events that are about to unravel. Whatever the terrors that are preparing to seize the night, a part of the responsibility lies with me. I have communed with eldritch powers, and I feel like I will soon have to pay the price. It all started when my stepdaughter called me fat, I've always thought that I was good with children. Every family gathering I would try to have at least one conversation with my brother's kids, just to see what the younger generation was up to. I even considered putting together a tour of my company that would talk about the history of the city in a way that teens would find interesting. I've always thought that I was good with children, until I met my stepdaughter. She wasn't my stepdaughter back then. I was just some guy dating her mum, but our relationship hasn't changed a single bit in the years.
He's too fat. Find someone else.
Liz said, as soon as her mother introduced me. Apparently this is how she treated every potential stepfather that was brought home. Apparently she actually really liked me and would surely loosen up on the fat jokes once I've moved into the house, once I married her mother, once she got used to me. But she didn't. To Liz, I was just some fat guy who lived under her roof. She would make eye contact with me if I took seconds during dinner. This stupid grin would bounce around her face whenever she saw me walk upstairs, and she would never miss an opportunity to comment on my weight. The pandemic didn't change that. It was just the two of us. Her mother had already left to be closer to work, and we were eating dinner. On the television, a serious-looking man in a silly homemade mask was reading out the new rules for the pandemic. Lockdown, effective as of midnight. No leaving the house unless it's for grocery shopping, work, exercise, or to provide aid in family emergencies. Liz burst out laughing. "What's funny?" I asked, hoping I could steer the conversation to a talk about how difficult it is being 16 during a global pandemic. My hopes were in vain.
I just imagined you exercising and it made me laugh.
Liz said, with that giant grin on her face.
Because you're fat.
She added, as if her jab wasn't direct enough. I wasn't going to be hard on the kid. She was just dealing with the pandemic in her own way. But that insult pushed something in me. Every evening my wife and me would talk on the phone. The plan was for me to fill her in on the daily happenings at home, but it became very clear that it wasn't my place to complain about her daughter. While I was going through domestic drama, she was dealing with equipment shortages, with double shifts, with constant chaos. I didn't want to bother her. After letting her vent her frustration about the situation, I told her everything was good at home and that we were looking forward to seeing her in 2 weeks. She assured me it wouldn't be 2 weeks. I laid in bed waiting for sleep to come, but it didn't. Everything my wife said about the state of the hospitals, the fears about the future of the tourist industry, an inability to plan further than a month ahead, it all floated around my skull and I desperately clawed at rest. But beneath all that fear was something else. A sadness, a memory of being laughed at in high school. The chilling pain whenever my stepdaughter made her stupid jokes. I could see myself lying there in bed, a human manifestation of sadness, a weird slob. It felt like I was outside of myself, like I was some eerie floating eyeball watching a middle-aged man scowl at his belly.
This can become a temple,
I had thought. But it was as if it wasn't my own. It was as if the words floated around in my forehead on a gentle summer breeze. I watched myself get out of bed, look in the mirror, have some sort of internal argument with himself, and then run out of the room. And then I was back. I was back in my own skin, but I had a sudden urge to go out and try jogging. It was the middle of the night. I'd never gone on a jog before, but something in me was just clawing at the chance to go. Without giving it much thought, I put on some sweatpants, grabbed a face mask, and ran out into the night. I didn't think, I just ran. My feet seemed to know where to go. They took me out of my neighborhood, down a forest path, past the standoff cabin near the edge of the woods, and towards the old reservoir. The journey wasn't easy. Everything hurt. Strange pains and cramps spread through my entire body as sweat rolled down my neck. My body felt horrible. But it was as if something else inside of me was pushing me on. An extra giving of force that made each step feel good. I ran around the reservoir in that mixture of physical pain and spiritual calm until my pains became unbearable. My body overcame my mind and I collapsed in the grass. My face mask was drenched. Wasn't much of a point wearing it anyway. I spread out on my back and I tried to catch my breath. The stars were plentiful that night. They've been plentiful every night since the lockdown. But there was something else about them that night. It was as if they were watching me, as if 1,000 senseless eyes were staring down at me, waiting for my next move.
This can become a temple,
whispered the forest.
All it requires is work,
answered the stars. I got up and hobbled my way back home. Whatever force made the run to the reservoir so enjoyable wasn't sticking around to help me get back home. I went to sleep with my body feeling like I was in a car wreck. I woke up worse. Yet even beneath all the aches, I knew that something in me had to run again. I was going to build that temple. The last thing I wanted was for Liz to follow me out to the reservoir and make a TikTok video of me struggling or something. For the first couple of runs, I was scared that she might be following me. It did, however, become pretty obvious Liz didn't care. She just spent all of her days inside of her room, watching her shows or having obnoxious Zoom sessions. I could do as much running around as I wanted. It was more difficult keeping the secret from my wife. It just didn't feel right talking about jogging with the type of stuff that was going on in her life. One night when we talked, she was in the middle of watching an old man die. He was alone in his room. No one was allowed in with him in order to minimize the risk of infection. She just stood on the other side of that window watching a man die on her break. I didn't want to drag my struggles with running into that. I just supported her, informed her that everything was peachy at home, and told her I was excited to see her in the next couple of weeks. She assured me it wasn't going to be a couple of weeks. The pain got more manageable over time, or my body just became numb, probably a mixture of the two. Whenever I walked funny, but on those runs, it was as if my body was a well-oiled machine. I was still absolutely drenched in sweat, and it made enough noise wheezing to scare off the wildlife, but whenever I was out there running, something in me just felt blissful, as if I was doing good work. As if I was making my way towards something holy. At some point, I started doing push-ups. I don't know which day it was. The runs were starting to blur into one long feeling of spiritual calm, mixed with the nuances of being trapped inside an aching mortal body. But at some point, I started doing push-ups. The sharp pain in my legs and abdomen were joined with a constant heavy weight in my arms. But whenever I went on those runs, that feeling would disappear beneath a cool air of satisfaction.
Why did you order a bunch of trash bags?
Liz asked me at the dinner table.
Trying to put yourself out for garbage pickup?
She quickly added, probably realizing that she didn't say anything offensive to me for longer than a minute. What trash bags? I thought. But that thought was immediately pushed away by a faint memory of ordering some online. Somewhere in that mental fog, I could recall looking for my credit card to finish off the online delivery. I could see myself stacking a couple of boxes of the bags in the garage. I just couldn't remember why. For trash, I guess, I mumbled, not wanting to trouble myself with the question too hard. Liz took me apart with those poisonous green eyes.
You'd better not be planning on running away with all that food,
She finally hissed and went back to her spaghetti. That night I couldn't fall asleep. I guess somewhere in the back of my head the question of my mental gaps bugged me. I went out on another run, hoping to clear my head. The beginning of the run lingered in the usual pained tranquility, but I just couldn't let go of the question. I just couldn't surrender myself to that feeling of peace, while the question stuck around at the back of my head. Why did I order a bunch of garbage bags? Suddenly there was a flash. I was still running. I could feel my feet hitting the trail. I could smell hints of the forest, but I wasn't there. Instead, I was back in middle school, standing in the changing room, everyone laughing, their eyes shining with malice. A horrid shudder travelled through my spine.
This can become a temple,
The crowd cheered in between bursts of laughter.
or it can all burn.
I didn't think much about the garbage bags after that. Other questions arose. Why are there blisters on my hands? Is the reservoir running out of water? Why does my back hurt so much? But each one of them was struck down with a soul-crushing vision. Bad childhood memories that I've spent most of my life pushing away. The taunts, the shoving, the shame, and beneath it all, I could see Liz grinning, that stupid grin she had whenever she saw me eat. If I didn't ask questions, I would just be confined to the gentle mental fog. I could be at peace during my jogs. I stopped asking questions. Time strung itself around into one rhythmic run, a perpetual movement that existed beneath a bunch of phone calls and dinners and bar charts about infection rates. The details of everything seemed vague and fuzzy. I just knew I was leaving the house a lot. There were short flashes of memory floating in the back of my head, images of the city, echoes of someone yelling at me, the tingling in my fingers from chopping wood. But it was all tied to the run. It was all tied to one long run. Then, suddenly, it was this evening, and I was standing in my garage with an axe in my hand.
Mom came back home because I told her you had a mental breakdown.
Liz yelled from the kitchen. The axe clattered out of my hand. She's joking. I came home because they didn't need me anymore. Where are you, honey? I could hear my wife walking around the house. In the darkness of the garage, I could see a bunch of garbage bags. They were filled with something rough and jagged. I could hear my wife walking towards the garage. I quickly got out to stop her from seeing whatever mystery was hiding in the dark room. She was happy to see me for a second. Then her eyes filled with shock. Oh, sweetie, what happened to you? The blisters on my skin made my hands look 100 years old. My body was covered with bruises, and I'd lost weight. The fact that I'd lost weight barely registered. She asked me if I was okay. She told me I'd look like hell. She told me that she was there for me if I needed to talk. A part of me wanted to deny that anything had happened. I could have just said everything was fine, but there was something in those eyes. Shimmered a love that beckoned honesty. I told her everything. I told my wife about the running, and the gaps in memory, and the confusion, and the bags in the garage. She listened patiently, occasionally pausing me to ask for clarification, but she listened. After I was done, she hugged me, told me I was loved, and then asked if I wanted to go see what was in the garage. Wood. The garbage bags were filled with wood. Not human heads or anything even remotely creepy, Just plain old, roughly chopped wood. Maybe chopping wood was part of my workout routine, I thought. And then I was certain that it was. It didn't explain much. The memory map of the past 3 months still barely fit together. But at least I had a piece of the puzzle. We went upstairs and talked more. At first, we tried to make sense of what could have led me to do so much damage to my body. But ultimately, we ended up talking about my body. She told me that she loved me for who I was, rather than what I looked like. That she only cared about whether I am healthy and happy with myself, and that I shouldn't take Liz's jokes personally. That's just how teenagers are. Just as she mentioned Liz, the next door window opened up, and we could hear Liz sneak out. I'll let her have her fun. New case numbers are down to low double digits, my nurse wife said. Then we made love. We were both exhausted from our separate battles during the pandemic, but even in our tiredness, we were passionate. Now she's sleeping on my chest, and I should be happy, but I'm not. I keep on searching through those memories, trying to understand what happened during the pandemic. But the flashes of reality are difficult to tell apart from the strange visions. I remember running up the stairs. I remember lunging trash bags around, with the plastic about to tear, but all these memories stem from an unreal place. I don't know what I've done, but there is a murmur in my head, in my chest, that whispers that I've been a part of something bad. Something's about to happen. In any moment, I will understand the true extent of my deeds. But for now, I am simply left with the stars, shining above us without any emotion, watching us.
My name is Liz. I'm 17 and I've done something bad. Can't say I'm super clear on the specifics of what actually went down over the past 3 months, but I know I've been a small part of something bad. Sorry if I get rambly. I'm operating on 2 cans of Red Bull and a hefty bong hit right now. Gotta stay awake, and weed is the only thing that stops the thing out there from crawling around in my head. Just needed somewhere to vent so I don't go crazy, and I've heard this corner of the internet is particularly welcoming to people going through bad situations. Look outside. The way those things shine in the sky, they're not stars. They're eyeballs. The wind is gone, the air is thick like someone is about to shoot off fireworks into a crowd, and those eyes are just looking down, waiting, watching. Something bad is about to happen, and I know I'm partially responsible. Something bad is about to happen, and I know it all started with me calling my stepdad fat. We've always had a weird relationship. When my mom first brought him home, I just presumed he was just someone to come over and fix our internet. Most of the guys she brought home before were just different versions of my pops. They all had tats, confusing facial hair, and every single one of them owned a bike that they referred to in some old lady name like Lucille or Beatrice. And then comes along this middle to management looking dope, dress shirt, balding, kind of chubby. The guy just stood there while my mom went through the usual, "This guy is going to have breakfast with us tomorrow" shtick. Then he extended his hand, put on his friendliest face, and said,
"Hello, Liz. My name's Greg. It's a pleasure to meet you. I heard you like Led Zeppelin."
"He's too fat. Find someone else." It just kind of rolled out of me. I don't know, sometimes I just like saying inappropriate things. Throw a wrench into the machination of life. Keep stuff interesting, you know? My ex Matt used to say that I actively sabotage social situations to ensure I don't get too attached to anyone. But the last time I checked, he isn't a therapist. He's 16 and a tool. I just got caught off guard by a stranger in the house, and I thought it would be funny to call him fat. Get off my case. He went red, my mom rolled her eyes at me, and I went over to my room. In the morning, Greg had breakfast with us. I might have thrown in a jab about the amount of syrup he was putting on his pancakes, but then he went home. Figured that would be the end of it, and my mom would go back to her usual selection of dangerous-looking men. But she didn't. This guy just kept on showing up to the house. Eventually he moved in. Eventually they got married. Greg tried to connect. He tried really hard. Kept asking me for movie recommendations and what it's like being a teen today and my opinions on literally anything that was on the television. But I just couldn't help myself. Had to call the dude fat. Seeing him blush and get flustered was just really funny. I needed the cheering up. I was dealing with the garbage fire that my breakup with Matt was. My stepdad asked me about it, but I told him to go eat something. What would a 40-year-old balding dude know about love anyway? Life chugged along at a decent pace. Mom worked at a hospital out in the city. Greg managed his tourism thing in the old town, and I crawled into senior year under a mountain of essays and goodbye forever Snapchats from Matt. Then Corona happened. You know the story. Deadly cough spreads from Wuhan to the rest of the world. Everything shuts down. Everyone spends their dinners watching the television, looking at bar charts and worrying about a collapse of modern society. Mom moved from the suburbs to the city to live with her sister so that she could be closer to the hospital, and I was left alone with Greg. The guy kept on trying to talk to me in that weird, let's be calm voice that he would put on whenever something bad was happening. The world was imploding outside and Greg wanted to be calm. I was having none of that. I was scared and there was no way I was going to let him turn a global pandemic into a bonding moment. Whatever attempt the guy made at connecting, I rebuked with a fat joke. But he just kept on pushing. I was doing a pretty decent job of holding him off until dinner rolled around. When I sat down to eat that bullshit spaghetti he makes, he asked me if I'd been crying. Hell yeah! I'd been crying. I was scared, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Just sat there in silence listening to the news. The newscaster on the screen had his usual sharp suit and gelled hair, but hid his face under a mask that had the distinct visual vibe of being pulled out of a dumpster.
Lockdown effective as of midnight. No leaving the house unless it's for grocery shopping, work, exercise, or to provide aid in family emergencies.
I burst out laughing. It wasn't a, oh, that's funny laugh, but more of a throaty release of energy that I didn't know what to do with. The fear of missing out on my graduation, on the house parties, on the chance to hook up with someone to make Matt jealous before he moves on to uni. You know, all that anxiety manifested into a strained chuckle.
What's funny?
Greg asked with that dumb, let me be your friend smile. I just imagined you exercising and it made me laugh. I blurted out. Because you're fat. Not my greatest comedic work, I'll admit. I've definitely delivered better zingers over the years, but this one, this insult pushed something in him. He didn't blush or look away. Something in him snapped. By the time I was back in my room, I stopped giggling. I started to feel a bit bad, but I just shrugged it off. He's an adult. Adults can handle these things. Every evening, my mom would call to check up on us and fill us in on the situation in the hospital. That evening, while I laid in bed scrolling through scary news articles, I could hear Greg talk to her through the wall. Guy didn't do a lot of talking. It was all just sighs and, that must be difficult, I'm so sorries, and I wish I could be there for yous. The guy might have the personality of a plain wallpaper, but there was a sweetness to him. If Matt would have talked to me like that, we'd still be together. I listened to Greg consoling my mom through the wall for almost an hour. Then she called me. She sounded like she'd been crying. I asked her how work was. She said it was hard. I didn't press further. Figured she'd already got it out of her system and didn't want to talk about it. I told her it's going to be a tough 2 weeks. She said it was going to be longer than 2 weeks. I then told her I was scared. She told me it would be fine. I told her I couldn't think about anything other than the pandemic. She told me I should only worry about things that are in my control, asked me to be nicer to Greg, and recommended me a bunch of shows to binge. Honestly, that's what's got me through this whole pandemic business. Binging content online. There's so much dope shit out there to watch. I mean, that night after getting off the phone with my mom, I committed myself to plugging into the internet and catching up on all the shows that I never had the time to watch. Breaking Bad, 6 Feet Under, and the goddamn Sopranos. There was so much great storytelling floating around the web to take my mind off of things. Worlds awaited me, just a couple of torrents away. Yet in that moment, as I was dragging down the internet speed of the house back in the 90s, something was happening next door. Out there, lying in quiet darkness, my stepfather snapped. Over the next couple of days, things gained a sense of normalcy. I quickly figured out how to make my webcam perpetually showing up as connecting in my online classes, and I was off the hook for learning anything of substance. Wasn't really missing out. It's not like I'll need algebra when I'm 30 anyway. All of my time was spent watching killer shows that made me yell at the screen in anticipation. The pandemic was happening outside, but in my room, I was in the midst of a courtroom drama, infiltrating the FBI with drug smugglers and flying around on dragons and shit. I mean, my head was so deep in other people's stories that I completely lost track of mine. The long panic-filled days turned into brisk binge-filled weeks. I would only leave the comfy nest of my room when I either needed to go to the bathroom or when I would eat with Greg. I was binging shows and Greg was changing. I guess I kind of noticed. Like, a part of me definitely registered that Greg wasn't looking great. He was still the same boring, balding dude who lived in my house, but he looked impossibly tired. I mean, he would stare into his food with bloodshot eyes, barely being able to lift his fork under the strain of his arm, and there was always a thickening aura of sweat around him. I figured that's just how people who have their tourist agencies wiped out by a major global catastrophe look like. Maybe if I reached out to him, asked him if he was all right, or at least what he spends his days doing, I don't know, maybe the sky would be calmer now? Maybe it wouldn't feel like something bad is about to happen. Maybe I could have stopped all of this. But I didn't. I guess that's a part of the bad thing I did. I didn't stop my stepdad's descent into madness. I don't know how many weeks into the lockdown this happened. Probably 2 months? Somewhere in that ballpark. Time gets kind of fuzzy when there's no distinction between days of the week. All I know is that I was bored with critically acclaimed stuff by then and was in the midst of an internet fringe animation phase. I ended up settling on Dinosaur Boy, an animated web series about crime-fighting dinosaurs. It was chugging along with the show, but in episode 4, just as the romantic interest realizes she is sexually attracted to dinosaurs, my internet froze. I closed and reopened Chrome a dozen times, messed around with the modem, even restarted my laptop, but nothing helped. It was 2 p.m. and I was stuck in the middle of an unexplainable internet drought. I got real bored, real quick. I took a shower, brushed my teeth, ate a yogurt, brushed my teeth again, and then collapsed into the couch to watch actual television. Nothing would make me skip a channel quicker than seeing a person in a suit next to a bar graph. The news was the last thing I wanted to watch, but even the regular channels couldn't keep my attention too long. A lion sleeping in a safari, interviews with people I don't care about, conspiracy theories about aliens, channel surfing was just an endless procession of stuff I didn't care about. It all felt so archaic. I wanted things tailored to my viewing, my habits delivered on a streaming platter without any effort on my part. I wanted to sit back and indulge in a mystery, something spooky and eclectic that I could lose myself in and make my quarantine season at least a little bit exciting. I turned off the television and started to make my way to my room. I figured that maybe the internet would be back, but before I could get back to my Dinosaur Boy, a noise out of the garage grabbed my attention. My mom had taken the car over to her sister's so that she wouldn't have to ride public transport. The garage was meant to be empty, but it wasn't. The only thing lighting up in the room was the overcast sun seeping in through the half-open garage door, but even in the dimness, I could see boxes piled all over the place. He stood in the middle of the garage like a puppet awaiting orders. He wheezed like he needed to be on a respirator. His hoodie was absolutely drenched in sweat, and he swayed from side to side as if he was about to collapse, but he didn't move an inch from where he was standing. "Greg?" I asked. "Is everything okay?" It was as if a burst of electricity went through his muscles. Without acknowledging me, Greg reached deep into one of the boxes, grabbed a bunch of baby blue-colored objects, and sprinted out the garage door. I stood there in shock for a couple of seconds. That was the first time Greg had ever ignored me. It was also the first time I had ever seen him run. I peeked outside the garage door. Greg was running towards the woods with determination of someone who's in the last kilometer of a marathon. I had gotten the mystery I wanted. "Why did you order a bunch of trash bags?" I asked during dinner. I figured that was the best angle of inquiry. Asking about his disheveled appearance or how he ignored me in the afternoon would have been too direct. After all, the contents of the boxes in the garage were just as mysterious as his behavior. His red eyes struggled to meet mine. The guy did not look well. I started to feel sorry for him. I might have made a quick quip about him being fat when that realization rolled around. Greg stared into his plate as if the answer to my question was hiding underneath his potatoes.
For trash, I guess.
He had no idea what I was talking about. I had made my stepdad uncomfortable 1,000 times before. I know what an uncomfortable Greg looks like, but what I saw in his eyes that night was not just discomfort. Me asking about the trash bags shook something deep inside of him. This man was haunted by something. "You'd better not be planning on running away with all that food," I mumbled to dull my empathy. My heart wasn't in it, I had to admit. I was worried about my stepdad. That night, for the first time since puberty hit, I kept my bedroom door cracked open. Back during the series-filled nights, I could recall the creaking of floorboards sneaking in past my headphones. Figured Greg was just going to the bathroom, didn't make anything of it. That night, through the crack in my bedroom door, I found out his nightly trips were not to the bathroom. I followed him. Greg grabbed another heaping of trash bags from the garage before he ran out onto the street. The guy moved with mechanic precision, as if he was some weird, sweaty, middle-aged wind-up doll that someone had decided to send on a jog down into suburbia. I ran a couple paces behind him and found myself losing my breath. I almost went home, figured that maybe my stepdad just got into a self-destructive exercise routine. Thought that nothing mysterious was at play. But then, the others started to appear. The gentle freshness of the night air was quickly replaced with the thick stink of a sweaty crowd. The closer we got into the forest, the more of them there were. Other joggers, all sorts of shapes and sizes, all wheezing through damp face masks that clung to their wet faces. They all looked like they had gone through whatever hell my stepdad had gone through. The pounding of the sneakers, the wheezing, it all amplified into a single procession of stomps and struggle. There was a low rumble in my head. I tried convincing myself that I was just imagining things, that the stink of the crowd was getting to me, that the barrage of footfalls was making me hear things. But soon, the rumble morphed into this thunderous, undeniable voice.
"Leave,"
it said.
"The 100-eyed God compels you to leave."
The voice was clear, but there was something else lingering beneath it. Something that crawled through my brain, searching, grabbing at parts of me that made me feel ill. My legs started to feel rubbery. I wanted to go home and crawl into bed. Greg got lost in the congregation of drenched hoodies and sweat palms, and soon enough the whole crowd of joggers stomped and wheezed past me. I couldn't go on. I stopped. The stink of the crowd drifted away. The stomping of the joggers drifted into the night until it was swallowed up beneath the chirping of crickets. Within a couple of minutes, it was as if they never existed at all. The crowd was gone. The voice was gone, but that thing, that strange force that ruffled through my brain was still unearthing everything it could. I stood in the middle of a tranquil suburbia, but my mind was on fire. I had spent the past 3 months binging through stupid shows when I could have been learning a new skill. I fried my brain on television while other people were learning shit, improving themselves. The economic system was going to collapse and I wouldn't get a real job until 30? I mean, my graduation was canceled. All of my friends were probably having secret house parties that I wasn't invited to. Matt was probably crushing on someone else. All of these thoughts came as one giant, never-ending wave of failure. I shuffled my feet back home, straining under the weight of my own thoughts. I was completely hopeless. As soon as I got home, I did the thing I always do when I'm feeling hopeless. I took a massive bong hit. I know, it's definitely not a healthy approach to things, but a bit of pot to recontextualize things can be actually good from time to time. That's at least what my biological dad used to say. Sometimes he'd shout it. Either way, that silky hit wiped all of the worries away. Suddenly, I was keenly aware of my age, how the pandemic was being handled in my corner of the world, and how I could do so much better than Matt. I popped in my headphones, threw on some Zepp, and floated on those godly licks. But even though my face was melting and my mind was floating thoughtlessly somewhere in the cosmos, there was a thirst in me. That mystery, that excitement of something out there, out of the ordinary that I craved for the past 3 months. This was it. The mystery of the 100-eyed God. It had a nice ring to it. Sobriety didn't lessen my commitment to finding out what the whole 100-eyed God thing was about. I spent the whole morning watching Greg like a hawk. If he was going to go on another Eldritch run, I was going to be right behind him. But Greg wasn't going anywhere. He spent all morning sitting on the couch staring into nothingness. I tried talking to him. Didn't even throw in any fat jokes. But all the guy would do is mumble something underneath his breath just to keep on staring into oblivion. I mean, the man was gone. By the looks of it, he had been gone for a long time. I looked into those blank eyes trying to find any sign of life, but all I could see was my own confused reflection.
I am tired.
He suddenly said with no emotion.
I will go take a nap. You should go enjoy your shows.
He staggered over to his room and shut the door. I went back to my room and prepared my supplies. When he peeked in through the crack in my door, all that Greg saw was his teenage stepdaughter lost in whatever award-winning series she was streaming on her laptop. He stared at me with those blank eyes for a bit, but I didn't twitch. He stood in my doorway for what felt like an eternity, but then he turned around and left. I could hear him walking towards the garage. I followed. The streets were considerably livelier than they were the night before. Groups of chatty dog walkers milled around catching up on their pandemic drama. People were sipping on beers out on their lawns. The world was slowly turning back to normal. Yet, as the asphalt of the suburbs turned into packed dirt of the forest, all traces of normality disappeared. The other joggers were back. The voice was back.
Leave.
It thundered.
The 100-eyed God compels you to leave.
As the words of the 100-eyed God echoed through my skull, as the sweat-drenched odor of the other joggers started to replace the piney scent of the forest, the thoughts came back. I had wasted 3 months of my life. Everybody secretly hated me. Matt was making out with someone else. I popped a joint in my mouth and sparked up. My lungs didn't agree with the mixture of smoking and exercising, but all traces of that forceful neuroticism that voice of the 100-eyed God provoked in my head were wiped away and replaced with an electric curiosity. Who were these people? Where were they going? What was this 100-eyed God? When the trees of the forest blocked out any sign of suburbia, another group of joggers emerged. As exhausted as the group that I was running with looked, the joggers that ran towards us from the forest looked even worse. Not only were they sweaty and sunburnt and unkempt, they were also straining their bodies beneath bloated trash bags filled with something so heavy that the plastic cut into their shoulders. What were they carrying? Why are they doing this? Where are they coming from? My last question was answered with a burst of sunlight. My jogging party had arrived at a clearing in the middle of the forest. It might have been the drugs, but for a split second, I completely forgot that I was in the midst of trying to uncover an eldritch mystery. For a split second, I couldn't help but to think that I was in the most peaceful place on earth. The water shimmered with a heavenly calmness. The reeds gently swayed in the summer wind. An air of calm hung over the beautiful pond that stretched out before me. This is the type of place where I would want to sit as an old woman and fish, I thought. I dreamed. But the stomping of joggers brought me back to reality. The group spread out through the clearing. A few of them started running laps around the lake, but most of the sweaty procession made its way towards the woods. That's when I noticed it. Beneath the peaceful chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of trees was another sound. The sound of axes against wood. Someone was out there cutting down trees. I also noticed something else. I wasn't alone with the joggers. Sitting by the side of the river, armed with a fishing pole, was an old man. When I approached him, the rumbling in the back of my skull started back up. The 100-eyed god was trying to get back into my head. I puffed him away. Wow, this is a chill spot, I said, sitting down on the grass next to the old man. For a second, he didn't acknowledge me. He just kept his eyes on the pond. But as I took another puff, he turned to me.
Yeah.
A look of confusion crossed his face, as if he was not expecting the voice he heard to be attached to a body. He quickly turned his attention back to the pond, but beneath all of those wrinkles, some sort of internal debate was happening. His brow furrowed. He looked back at me.
You know what all these sweaty people want?
I don't know. One of them is my stepdad. He's really dopey. Think it's a cult or something. I took another puff. The old man's nose twitched in recognition. You want a hit? I asked.
No.
He turned his attention back towards the pond. The guy did not want to talk. I sat there for a bit, taking in the sun and tranquility of the pond, but I couldn't focus on the beauty of this place with all that wheezing and stomping that the joggers supplied. I couldn't focus with the chomping sounds coming from the woods. As I moved through the dark underbrush, I passed by the other joggers. Some were running towards the noise, others were returning back, weighed down with the trash bags on their shoulders. I was completely invisible to them. The rest of the world was completely invisible to them. They just moved through their mysterious motions like sweaty puppets. The chomping grew louder. Stumps and jagged chunks of wood started to litter the floor. Before me, a makeshift lumber operation stretched out. The men and women who chopped at the felled trees were different from the joggers I had seen before. They weren't just covered in sweat. They were covered in blood. It dripped from their calloused hands down to their axes and their hoodies of their skin. They didn't care. They just chopped away at the wood and threw the jagged chunks into a large pile. From there, other joggers loaded up the wood into trash bags and ran off to God knows where. For a couple of minutes, I just stood there and watched and trying to make sense of it all. They all just worked away at their tasks as if they were part of some giant sweaty machine. Not one paid the slightest bit of attention to me. Some of the arriving joggers would even bump into me. I was completely invisible to them. Until I wasn't. It all happened so quickly. A scream came from the pond. It sounded like the old man, but before I was able to even fully register that he was crying for help, something else grappled for my attention. The rumbling in the back of my skull was back. The joggers, they stopped chomping. They were all staring at me. As they spoke, the voice of the 100 God echoed through my skull.
You've been warned.
They all echoed, so desperately tired, yet the voice in the back of my head bristled with savage energy.
The 100-eyed God demands you to leave this place.
The blood-stained axes were lifted. The procession of sweaty souls started to walk towards me. I tried lighting my joints up again, but all that was left was a roach.
You have been warned,
they said, as they started to swing the axes from side to side.
The 100-eyed God demands you to leave this place.
One of the joggers swung his axe wide and embedded it in a fellow running enthusiast. Her gray hoodie quickly streaked with red. He didn't acknowledge his slip. Neither did she. I ran as fast as I could. I called my mom as soon as I got home. I told her that Greg wasn't dealing well with the pressure of looking after me. I told her whatever I needed for her to get back home. Luckily for me, the emergency rooms that once held people who needed ventilators were now back to mainly serving unlucky drunks. My mom came back home. She could see something was wrong with Greg as soon as she walked in the house. I was sure that Greg was gone, that whatever the hell he went through over the past 3 months had completely squeezed any amount of personality out of him. But all it took was one hug? As soon as my mom wrapped her arms around him, it was as if he plunged back into reality. He told her that he had started exercising, that he wanted to impress her by losing weight, but that something bad took control. He couldn't remember most of what happened over the past 3 months. There were flashes of memories, but none of them made any sense. Greg's voice was shaky at first, as if he was getting used to being back in his skin, but soon enough he calmed. Soon enough he was back to being regular, aggressively boring Greg. The three of us had dinner, and I did my best not to make any fat jokes. It was nice knowing that Greg didn't fall into some mental abyss, and I was more than ready to pass out after all the running I had done. But as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, the mystery of the 100-eyed god wouldn't give me rest. My head was filled with too many questions for me to rest. I rolled another joint to take my mind off of things. It simply made the questions more potent. Who is the 100-eyed god? What is happening out there by the pond? Why does it feel like tonight is the beginning of something horrid? I wrestled with these questions. I tried to push them out, but that mystery, that thirst, wouldn't let me rest. I knocked back 2 more Red Bulls, took a bong hit for good measure, and snuck out of the house. The pond is no longer tranquil. In fact, the pond no longer exists. The water is gone. Where once stood a little forest Shangri-La, there is now a raw, muddy crater filled with dying fish. There was no procession of sweaty joggers as I made my way towards the pond tonight because they were already here. They stand, wheezing and exhausted, ready to serve their enigmatic master. Shambling figures emerge from the woods. These people are not wearing workout clothes, but they look like they've been through the same hell that all those joggers have been through. With veiled offerings in their hands, they join the crowd. There is a tension in the air, as if 1,000 lightning bolts are to strike at the same time. The crowd looks up towards the sky, and the stars shine down like 1,000 eyes. They are watching. They are waiting.
So this is Reddit, huh? Up until a couple of hours ago, I'd not been aware of this corner of the internet. In fact, up until a couple of hours ago, I'd not been aware that the internet itself exists. Yet browsing through this forum, reading all these harrowing accounts of personal misfortune, and watching videos of people's sanity slipping away in public, I feel like I'll quickly make myself at home here. You must be wondering what happened tonight. Why the air feels so oppressive. Why the stars are shining down like 1,000 shapeless eyes. And I will tell you in time. But the body that I have taken is old. These withered fingers struggle and shake against the keyboard. They need to be warmed up. Before I speak of this night, I want to tell you a story. A story of a plague hundreds of years in the past. It will help you understand. It all sounded like a horrid tale to scare small children, or perhaps like a political provocation. Nonetheless, the stories that the merchants told did not sound real. Yet all across the empire, in the quaint villages, in the industrious towns, in the bustling cities, the merchants would tell the exact same story. Vienna had been taken by the plague. The streets were filled with hundreds, no, thousands of dead. Chaos and crime and flames had taken control in the capital. The royal seat of the Habsburgs had tasted the thundering wrath of God. and soon the rest of the empire would join its suffering. The more the merchants drank, the more detailed their stories became. They spoke of wailing mothers, of shambling corpses, of family trees snuffed out through festering pustules. The more the merchants spoke, the less they were believed. The other patrons of the bar would complain of the stench of alcohol on the merchants' breaths. Only a drunkard would think that a city such as Vienna could be shaken by a mere sickness. But by the time morning arrived, the patrons would slowly come to learn that the story they had heard was not of fiction. Yes, the exhausted travelers reeked of alcohol as they told their mad tale, but there was something else on their breath as they spoke in those tightly packed pubs. A microscopic seal of authenticity, which the patrons soon became intimately familiar with. A plague breeds despair. There is only so much pain and suffering that a human mind can witness before it closes in on itself. The world outside becomes a morbid facsimile of what it was. Sickness seizes the land. Thoughts of a life without the constant presence fear became a distant memory. In this new demented world, one does not investigate the logic of things. One simply does whatever is in their power to survive, be it with sanity or without. When the corpse pickers descended upon Bohemia, no one inquired where they came from. There were bloated corpses in the streets that needed to disappear, and the haggard-looking men seemed more than willing to provide transport on their rickety carts. The common folk presumed that the bodies were being carted away to a mass grave, or to one of the fire pits that were so prevalent in the beginning of the outbreak. But the bodies which the corpse pickers collected were not destined for disposal. No, they were destined for something much greater. The corpse pickers traveled with their cadaver-filled carts towards the heart of the continent, the capital of Bohemia, the Golden City, Prague. Yet before they would reach the towering Gothic gates, they would veer off to a nearby forest. The wooden wheels would groan on the unkept forest roads, chunks of liquefied flesh would drip from the edges of their carts, but as arduous as the journey was, the corpse pickers didn't complain. They knew that their task was of an unimaginable cosmic importance. With sunken eyes and empty stomachs, they worked away at their duty. Hidden within the dark forest was a clearing in which hundreds of years ago men similar to the corpse pickers had dug their mark into the earth. The corpse pickers knew nothing of the previous failed construction attempts in the meadow. They knew nothing of the rituals that the church had foiled. All they knew was that they were servants of Otto Knoch. Before the plague, while his family was still alive, when his thoughts were still his own, Otto would have nightmares. They were implacable things. As soon as the man would wake up, whatever concrete fears that had haunted him in his dreams would become wisps of smoke from a fire that he could not place, visions of meadows and bones and whispered secrets. Otto did not make much of these haunts. Whenever the night terrors arose, he would simply walk through his home and remind himself of his life. His wife was caring and spoke no ill of him. His daughters were beautiful enough to be married into powerful families, and Adam, his eldest, had enthralled the intelligentsia in Vienna enough to be admitted to a prestigious university. Otto, however, was not just wealthy in terms of his family, through a bloodline tied closely enough to the Habsburgs to provide power, but far enough away to not provide birth defects. Otto was able to secure employment as a royal architect in Prague. The home that he inhabited in the heart of the city still left him in awe in terms of its sheer size and luxury. The knowledge that his works would tower through the ages still made him smile. The joy of his good fortune still met him every morning. The occasional nightmare seemed only fair. It balanced the state of things. When the haunts made a return to sleep untenable, Otto would grab his pipe and go out on his balcony. One of his friends, the same one that suggested Adam become a doctor, told Otto that a bit of tobacco in the evening would be good for his humors. A restless mind needed something hot and dry to calm. Otto was partial to agree. After a couple puffs on his pipe and a bit of stargazing, he would forget about the whole ordeal and was ready to go to bed. It was just a nightmare, after all. He was a resilient man. He wasn't going to let a bad dream get to him. Yet before he pulled the curtains shut, Otto would stare out at the sky for just a couple of moments. I can't help but to think that somewhere inside, he knew. He knew the stars were watching him. He knew those visions weren't simple nightmares. The fortunes of the Empire shifted, as did Otto's luck. In the span of a week, the bustling markets that were outside of Otto's courtyard were replaced with a hasty construction. The people were desperate. The sickness had to be stopped. A plague pillar was being put up. Surely God would see it and take pity upon his followers. Yet the God that they worshipped had no eyes for them. Even after the monument was unveiled, the death continued. Soon enough, the streets went quiet. All Otto could hear through his window were rattling carts and insane ramblings about the Empire's jewelry. Otto's projects were suspended, but he had been frugal enough to not worry about money. What truly weighed on the architect's heart was the fate of his son. When Adam had left for Vienna, his correspondence was detailed and regular. But as soon as the plague doctors were summoned, his letters ceased. Otto attempted to remain optimistic. Surely his son's letters had simply gotten lost in the chaos. But there was doubt in his thoughts. Otto's wife feared the worst. The night terrors became regular occurrences. Every night Otto would wake in a cold sweat, his mind still stuck in the dreamscape. Somewhere out there in the recesses of his mind was a tower, just like the plague column the peasants outside of his home had constructed. Yet the structure of his nightmares wasn't made of stone. The structure of his nightmares wasn't made for a forgiving God. Regardless of how freakish his dreams had become, however, Otto remained steadfast. He stopped looking at the stars and busied himself with speculative work on new constructions. In his occupation, he found a semblance of solace. Yet his work required a concentrated mind, and soon enough, his daughters made that impossible. As soon as Otto's wife noticed the serving girl coughing, she removed her from the home. But she was too late. The disease was in the home. Otto and his wife went through a gentle case of the deadly disease. They were weak and feverish, but their ill health was incomparable to their children's ailments. The best doctor gold could buy was dispatched for, but he made no difference. With his daughters on death's door and no word of Adam, Otto soon became seized with the realization that he was to outlive his children. His wife prayed to drown out the sounds of their daughter's feverish suffering. Otto simply listened. Their rattling cough sounded like bones being crushed up in a monstrous maw. He was the one who found them. It was during one of his midnight smoking sessions that he decided to walk down and check on his daughters. They died together, their bodies embraced in a desperate hug. Otto wept at the edge of their bed, his blood hot with fury against whatever god that would turn his daughters from children to corpses. But it was between those tears that he heard the voice.
"Take them outside,"
I whispered.
"Those that will take care of them are on their way."
His sobbing stopped. He listened to hear my voice again, but I did not need to speak. Otto recognized the voice from his dream. and it did chill his blood to hear me in his waking state. But he also recognized he wanted to spare his wife the horrid, bloated visage. Otto obeyed his first command. By the time he had dragged the sheet outside, they were already waiting for him. The two men outside looked horribly destitute. Their hair was unkempt and unshaven, their clothes were worn past their years, and both of the men wore the signs of exhaustion on their face. Yet they had a cart at the ready, and something in the back of Otto's soul told him they were the people who would dispose of his burden. The corpse pickers wordlessly loaded up his daughters onto their cart and then disappeared into the night. His wife was furious. She wanted a Christian funeral for her children, not to have them dragged off in the middle of the night by corpse pickers. Otto had few words for her. He scarcely understood his own mind by then. All he knew was that he had to find some hope to stay sane. Perhaps some new arrivals in the court would have news of Vienna. Perhaps someone would assure him that Adam was still alive. He sat in the room where months prior she told her daughters fairy tales. Her mind was flooded with incomprehensible grief. Those little girls were gone. Her son was gone as well. How would she live without them? A voice whispered to her through the windowsills. I told her where Otto kept the flintlock. While Otto was desperately clawing for information in the castle, a pistol shot echoed through his home. The architect was one step closer to his destiny. The corpse pickers took her away. Otto was left alone in his home. No matter how high the ceiling stretched, how plentiful the rooms of his house were, Otto felt trapped. The rest of the building was irrelevant. Reality had been distilled down to him, the blood-stained room and the pistol that lay on the floor. His fingers twitched with want. Somewhere in him there was a need to pick up the flintlock and place it back in its case. But he also knew that if he felt the cold steel of the gun, he would simply load and shoot.
Just go on a walk. Just walk away.
A gentle voice drifted in through the open window. Otto left the weapon on the roof and set out on the street. He wandered aimlessly through the city, or at least he thought he wandered aimlessly. In truth, all of his steps were carefully planned by a mind that was not his own. It was not necessary to order Otto to take a specific direction. No puppet strings were needed. With the mere suggestion of a path, his hopeless soul followed. Otto chose to walk through the dirty streets. He chose to walk out of those Gothic gates and past the villages and down those forest paths. In his mind, he ended up in the meadow on his own accord. The hole in the ground, the surrounding trees, the air of oppression, it all seemed so familiar to him. It didn't take Otto long to recognize that the meadow in which he was standing was the same place he had seen in his dreamscape. The only thing that was missing was the column of bones. In its stead, there was what appeared to be a pile of rags. Otto moved closer to investigate. He did not need to walk far. However, the shifting wind revealed the true nature of the pile soon enough. The unquestionable, inescapable stench of rot filled Otto's nostrils. What was before him was not a pile of old rags, it was a heap of bloated, decomposing corpses.
What do you wish us to do, Master Knoch?
A chorus of voices asked. Behind Otto stood a grouping of the corpse pickers, each more disheveled than the other. Their eyes looked at Otto with religious adoration.
Your will is our command. What do you wish us to do, Master Knoch?
In the back of his throat there were words that were edging to come out, words that seemed to have seeped into his skull from a foreign place, words that he knew would ease his suffering as soon as they left his lips. But Otto refused to listen to the voices that echoed through his head. He fled the strange disheveled men of the meadow and ran all the way back to his spacious home. The nightmares got worse. Otto did whatever was in his power to set off sleep. He read, he smoked, he even managed to find a source of coffee from the royal court. Yet the visions that Otto lost because of lack of sleep came back to him in his waking life. The whispers, the flashes of another world, they all became undeniable. A tower reaching up towards the night sky, made of things that were once alive. Its sharp, hooked spires reach towards the darkened heavens. They grasp at the stars. Those glowing orbs shine like 100 eyes in the night. They're watching. They're waiting. They are here to welcome the 100-eyed god. Clean the bones. Otto would find himself muttering under his breath as he wandered his house. That was what the voice in the back of his head wanted him to say to the corpse pickers. At first, it made no sense, but as the visions became more distinct, the puzzle pieces of his nightmarish existence started to fall into place. He knew that giving the order would free him of the dread that lingered at the pit of his soul. But he also knew that as soon as he ordered those mysterious, dirty peasants to act, he would be trapped in something much more horrid. For days he resisted that eldritch call. He wandered the court in search of news about Adam. He contemplated the escape route that the flintlock pistol offered. He did whatever was in his power to ignore the yearning to go back to the meadow. But Otto was simply not strong enough. One day he found himself walking out of the city. He knew where his feet were leading him. He was too tired to stop them. The stench and size of the pile had grown since he had last seen it, but the devotion of the corpse pickers remained the same. They stood by the hill of corpses with bottomless adoration in their hollow eyes.
"What do you wish us to do?"
they asked in unison. Clean the bones. As soon as the words left his lips, a surge of relaxation pulsed through his body. His knees buckled beneath the unbearable lightness that he suddenly felt in his heart. Otto sat down in the grass and watched the corpse pickers work. They took the bodies one by one and stripped them down to the bone. Some of the flesh had become so tender that it neatly slipped off, whilst the fresher limbs required visible force. Yet regardless of the effort, the result was the same. A pile of picked bones started to manifest next to the corpses, and chunks of flesh rolled down into the hole at the center of the meadow.
The presence of death will bring him closer,
I whispered to Otto.
The 100-eyed god requires a sacrifice of life if he is to be summoned.
My words calmed his nervous soul. Watching the corpse pickers work let Otto forget about the plague, about his family, about the helpless nature of his mortal coil. He was now a part of something bigger. His life would be given meaning through his actions. Otto was going to help usher in an incomprehensible force. "Stack the bones," he whispered, as the sun started to set. Even though the corpse pickers were hard at work hauling the bodies and stripping the flesh, they reacted to his order immediately. The crowd split in two. Half the corpse pickers continued to work at the flesh, whilst the others started to stack the bones, together, into pallets. The strange project that was slowly taking shape in front of Otto's eyes filled the man with a shuddering calmness. This was what his life was now. He was overseeing the construction of a monument for the 100-eyed god. He woke up in his bed with faint memories. In the back of his skull there were images of a dark forest, of him stumbling through the streets of Prague as the sun burnt his exhausted eyes. He knew he had somehow gotten home, but the specifics of the journey eluded him behind a thick mental fog. Otto woke up in his own house, but he knew he was needed elsewhere. He let his feet lead him back to the meadow. In times of obsession, time dilates. Every second that Otto spent at the construction was drenched in passionate perfection. What was being erected in front of him was beautiful. Each bone was laid in the exact spot that the universe had intended for it. There was a chaotic elegance to the way the rib cages interlocked into thick rings of sharpness. The hours that Otto had spent in the meadow were the happiest moments of his life. Yet when he tried to think back to them, to a specific moment, he couldn't. The days blurred into one long night of watching the skeletal tower rise from the ground, intercut with a blaring, cruel sun that ushered in the day as he stumbled through the streets. He would wake in his bed with the gentlest idea of the life he once lived, of the joy his family had brought him. But then it would all be washed away by his responsibilities. As the tower of bones grew taller, and the weeks turned into months, his morning nostalgia faded away as well. The only thing that Otto was capable of thinking about was his duty to the hundred-eyed god. "Father?" He stood at the foot of Otto's bed. For a second, Otto feared that one of the corpse pickers had followed him home. The youth that stood before him was unshaved and wore tattered clothes. Yet there was a light in his eyes. He was not some mindless worker, he was... Adam. "My son." He recognized him. The two hugged and cried and tried to make sense of the world together. The thought of the bone spire completely slipped Otto's mind. I tried as hard as I could to sink my whispers into his brain, but the man was simply too occupied seeing his son come back from the dead. The partial family reunion seeped away at the dread that allowed me to control Otto. It seemed like my efforts had been in vain. The architect of the bone spire would push aside the madness of his work to be a father. The perceived lunacy of the construction would be confined solely to his mind, and when he would die, the memory of the meadow would die with him. I thought I'd lost him, but I did not. Adam talked at length of his life in Vienna. He told his father of how the plague had steadily chipped away at the city until nothing but chaos remained. He talked of his struggle to find food, to make his way back home. Otto carefully listened to the plight of his son and assured his child that he would never let such suffering meet him again. Yet as the sun rose over the skyline of the city, Otto was reminded of his own suffering. That blaring ball of fire that would scorch his eyes whenever he stumbled back home from the bone spire loosened his lips. He told Adam about the construction. Adam didn't understand. Surely his father wasn't stumbling out to the meadows to oversee a construction made of bones, under the directions of a whispering eldritch voice. Surely his father was simply speaking in metaphors. But he wasn't. As that dreaded sunlight filled the room, Otto's words became more plain. There were men out in the woods who tore away at the flesh of corpses to free the bone. These men were acting under his orders. The instructions that he gave them were not words of his own composition. Otto was speaking for a demented voice that dwelled deep in his chest. Adam demanded to see the construction. Otto was beyond exhausted, but he knew that he could not rest if the maddening images of the spire were in his mind alone. The father and son walked to the meadow. As they walked through the forest path, Adam started to choke back coughs. Food had been scarce on his journey back to Prague, but even the little bit of bread that he had in his stomach wanted out.
"Father,"
the youth dry heaved.
"Do you not smell it?"
He didn't. Otto could sense something in the air, a gentle smell of rot that danced through the forest, but the scent didn't disagree with him. It was simply the smell of his work. It was work that needed to be done. Even though the tower was made of brittle human bones, there was an air of stability that lingered behind it. Even though it was constructed by men who were scarcely more than skin-draped skeletons, a momentous power surrounded the construction. "Father, you cannot be here," his son whispered. "What is happening here? It's not Christian. Whomever these men are, whatever they are constructing, Father, this is an affront to humanity. The plague has driven you mad. Please, let's go home, Father." But Adam's pleading words did not reach Otto's ears. As he gazed upon the jagged monument he had helped build, an irresistible pride blossomed in his chest. Otto was a part of something bigger, of something inconceivable. Otto was a servant of the 100-eyed God. His spirit loosened. He let me speak through him. "Go home, son," he said. "I have work to do." Adam tried to speak calmly. Then he started to argue. Then he started to shout. It made no difference. His father's mind was elsewhere. His father's mind was entangled in the cosmic importance of the bone spire. All throughout the argument, the corpse pickers continued to strip and stack the bones, completely ignoring the father and son. When Adam laid a hand on his father, however, when he wanted to drag Otto back to their home and contact one of the royal physicians, the work ceased. The corpse pickers crowded their youth and removed him from the meadow. Otto didn't mind. He had to concentrate on his work. That was the last time Otto would ever see his son. The meadow was his home now. Adam made further attempts to rescue his father from the clutches of his work, but whenever he approached the meadow, the corpse pickers would be there to block his way. If he persisted, if he attempted to push past them to get to his father, the corpse pickers would be there to beat him until he relented. After weeks of attempting to break through, Adam gave up. He started to drink. To remove the need for Otto to leave the construction, a small wooden cottage was put together by the corpse pickers. Otto's days blurred back into one long stay at the construction site, with flashes of the sun breaking apart the nights. The corpse pickers became more numerous. There were more bodies to be brought in, more bones to be cleaned, more work to be done on the construction. Yet, as time dragged on, other people joined the procession of the meadow. Exhausted artisans carrying the fruits of their labor, hungry bakers with hands full of bread, manic merchants who let their gold spill down into the hole that had before festered with rotting flesh. They came each night, tired and afraid, but tied by their souls to a power much greater than them. Their low chants echoed through the forest. "He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he shall walk the earth. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon his eyes shall judge our souls. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he will arrive." The column was almost finished. Its peak lumbered among the treetops, reaching up towards the heavens, grasping for the stars that shined in the night like hundreds of glaring eyes. Otto knew that his work was nearly complete. Soon the 100-eyed God would answer the call. Yet, on the evening when the moment of arrival seemed imminent, when the crowds and chants had grown to an undeniable size, when the air was thick with electricity and the stars watched the world below with fascination, they came. They rode through the forest on horses carrying banners of a false god, singing hymns of false prophets. They came with swords and fire and muskets and crossbows. The warriors of the church descended upon the meadow and destroyed all that Otto had worked for. The last thing that the architect saw was the tower of bones crashing down to the ground. His magnificent structure broke into jagged fractures of bones as soon as it hit the earth. Then a sword of a fanatic pierced his chest and ended his life. Within moments, the gathering that was meant to usher in a new era of humanity was burned and crushed into oblivion. It was all Adam's work. When he first started drinking, he spoke of Otto Knoch's obsession in obtuse terms. His father was slaving away at a strange project with strange people. He had gone mad after the deaths that had plagued his family, but as the mead and beer and schnapps seeped away at his tongue, Adam's words became more direct. His drunken ramblings soon became a rumor that spread through the empire. Somewhere near Prague, in a secluded forest meadow, there was a man building a column made of bones. It was only a matter of time before the story reached the church. A couple of months after the bone spire had been torn down, Adam's body was found in the river. The man died a drunk, not knowing that he was directly responsible for his father's death, not knowing that his loose tongue had prevented the arrival of the 100-eyed god. You might find yourself with questions. Why am I telling you this story? How do I know all this? Who am I? I use the tale of Otto Knoch to illustrate that what happened over the past couple months is nothing new. Plagues have always bred despair. There have always been desperate minds that have levitated towards the darkness in times of crisis. Prayers and servitude to the 100-eyed god are nothing new. Every time that death has spread through the land, the whispered truths in the darkness have taken hold of weaker minds. The attempts to summon the 100-eyed god have always been foiled, be it by the church, be it by the government, be it by other groups that operate beneath the awareness of the public. The attempts to summon the 100-eyed god have always been foiled. Until tonight. The way the air bristles with electricity, the way the stars stare down at the world below, it is not a simple figment of your imagination. It is a sign that the 100-eyed god walks the earth. And as for my identity, the question of how I was able to tell Otto's tale with such detail, it's because I was there. I lingered in the shadows when his life was whole, and I walked through the darkness as it slowly fell apart. I whispered in his ear every step of the way, and I pulled the puppet strings when the moment required it. I typed these words through the arthritic fingers of an old fisherman, but my identity should not be much of a mystery.
Above us, the stars shine like 1,000 shapeless eyes. The air is thick with an oppressive energy and the smell of rotting fish. Just as I think the crowd around the crater is done growing, that the audience for whatever eldritch ritual is about to occur has gathered in its entirety, more gaunt figures emerge from the woods. There's too many to count, but my eyes drift past their faces, and I try to remind myself that these are real human beings who have somehow gotten wrapped up in all this madness. A barefoot man approaches the crowd. He's not wearing anything other than dirty underwear and a coat. His eyes are sunken deep into his skull. He is sleep deprivation personified to the tune of a caricature. In his blistered hands, he carries a wooden statuette. He holds it against his chest as if it were a baby that needs protection. Yet the closer he gets to the crowd, the more confident he becomes. Once he is at the crater, he raises the statuette above his head. Others in the crowd raise similar carvings. The idols have the shape of a man, yet where a head should be, there is simply a bulbous mass of eyeballs. Even from my hiding place in the bushes, I feel like the eyeballs are watching me. At another corner of the meadow walks a woman with an apron. Her face is caked with flour and blood and grime. Somewhere beneath all of it, she's pretty. But the question of her attractiveness is just a passing thought. What grabs my attention is the cake she holds in her hands. A perfectly shaped circle of white frosting drizzled by the scarlet of blood. The closer she gets to the crowd, the higher she lifts the cake. Most of her fingers are gone, as are the fingers of the other bakers who raised their own baked goods. The bakers and the artisans all mingle among the sweat-drenched joggers. Those blotched gray sweatsuits, those exhausted eyes, those heartbreaking expressions of suffering. As I watch them, I can't help but wonder if my stepfather would be among them if things had turned out differently. Instead, my stepdad is sleeping. He's sleeping next to my mom at home. My stepdad is at home and I am stoned out of my mind, hiding in the bushes watching the cult of the 100-eyed god. My phone vibrates. Oh my god, it's Max, my ex.
Hey, how you holding up? I miss you. We should hang out sometime. I'm really bored. Can you recommend me some shows?
Oh my god, I put away my phone. I could definitely recommend him some shows. I had spent the entirety of the pandemic binging through all the critically acclaimed television that I'd missed out on the world before it went to shit. But I can't talk about that right now. I can't talk to him right now. I am too busy watching a crowd of desperate men and women attempt to summon deranged primal evil. I am also way too stoned to multitask. Oh my god, marijuana is the only thing that keeps whatever metaphysical brain parasite that is controlling the crowd out of my head. A leftover of the bong hit I took before I left the house is still floating around in my system, but I can feel its influence fading away. The rumbling in the back of my skull is coming back. Whatever is out there is reaching out for me, trying to get into my head. There's still the emergency blunt left, but I'm hesitant to light it up. Once that bit of weed is spent, I'm on my own. The wind dies down. The birds stop singing. Even the sounds of the far-off highway disappear under an unnatural silence. The crowd raises their offerings above their head, and in low, tired voices they begin to chant.
He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he shall walk the earth. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon his eyes shall judge our souls. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he will arrive.
The fish at the bottom of the pond couldn't have been dead for that long. After all, just yesterday the reservoir was filled with water. Yet as the hollow chant of the crowd echoes through the meadow of the bodies of the fish, they start to lifelessly flop. Their scales bristle as strings of flesh escape the confines of their bodies. The pink strips of slithering meat crawl towards the center of the crater, all gathering into one horrid mass. The blob pulses with life. With each tremor, the rumbling in the back of my head grows. Something is crawling its way into my brain. I spark up. The initial flush of peace envelops my body like cotton candy, but the calm doesn't last. There's jagged claws trying to make their way back into my head. A thundering voice bounces around my soul.
Come closer. The 100-eyed god commands it.
There's a tension in my knees. A part of me desperately wants to get up and follow the voice. A part of me wants to hurl myself into the empty pond and embrace the monstrosity of flesh, to feel the vibration of its slick skin, to surrender myself to it. But no, I'm high enough to know that that's not a good idea. I purse my lips around the blunt and inhale like a fish having a panic attack.
Come closer.
The voice rumbles, but I can barely hear it. Be it lack of oxygen or excess of hot smoke, my body starts to fall off a cliff that doesn't exist. Matt sends me another message, but the vibration moves from my pocket all across my body. Warmth rushes to my face. I pass out. My eyes are closed, but I can see him. A small, shriveled up body hangs from a bulging mass of eyeballs. They can see me.
I am the 100-eyed god,
he says, without a presence of an obvious mouth.
Why have you disturbed the ritual of my summoning?
The rumble in the back of my skull is gone. Something in the bottom of my gut tells me he can do me no harm. Something tells me I have burnt enough grams to be invincible against any form of mind control. Curiosity, I guess. I try to smile to let him know I'm not scared, but I'm way too stoned to move my face.
Curiosity.
As he laughs, the frail limbs of his body bounce from side to side like wind chimes made of flesh.
And what has your curiosity brought you?
I know my stepdad is lying in bed with my mom. They've both had a horrible 3 months, and now they're finding peace in each other's sleepy embrace. It's kind of gross imagining them, but I'm happy he's safe. I open my mouth to speak, to tell the 100-eyed god that if it wasn't for my snooping, then Greg would be in the crowd surrendering the crater, but he cuts me off.
Yes, your false father is momentarily safe. Your incessant need to intrude on his work has taken him from my grasp, but none of that will matter soon. Soon your world shall burn with the fire of madness. Soon all that you love and hold dear will be no more. Your kind has been judged and found wanting. Soon you shall taste the wrath of the 100-eyed god.
You can read my mind? I ask. His tiny body sways back and forth. Those shapeless eyes have a hint of frustration behind them.
Yes.
He replies.
Yes, I can read your mind. But that is not important. I can do so much more, little girl. With nothing but a simple wish, I can force a man to spill the blood of his entire family. I can crush a soul beneath the unavoidable weights of its past. What was once a passion can become an inescapable set of chains if I will it so. I am the 100-eyed god. None shall resist my power.
Unless they're high. Another vibration goes off in my pocket. Matt's inability to survive without being the constant center of attention reminds me why the two of us broke up. I promise myself that after I give him a list of shows to watch, I'll block him forever.
Your cheap herbal tricks would only stave off the inevitable. Once the ritual is complete, and my power in your realm reaches its true potential, I will make you pray for death. Your entire civilization will drop to its knees and beg for forgiveness. They will plead with me. They will promise they will change their ways and use their time in the realm of the living more wisely, but I am the 100-eyed god. I do not know of mercy. The earth shall burn, the seas will boil, and...
Why? I ask.
Why?
He laughs again, this time with pompous confidence.
Why do I not know forgiveness? Because my eyes sees all, little girl. I have watched the world close down on itself with this plague. I have seen the world shutter its windows and lock its doors with 100 plagues. People are given time to grow, to learn, to improve, but what do they do instead? They despair. They despair and waste their time. If one cannot make use of one's life, one does not deserve to live it.
You want to destroy the world because people weren't productive during a global pandemic? That's pretty unhinged, dude. I say, feeling starts to return to my lips. My blunt is still in my mouth. I'd take another puff for good measure.
It is more complicated than that.
Oh yeah?
Yes.
A palpable silence spreads out through the dreamscape. Suddenly, the mass of eyeballs flies within inches of me. The frail body flops around as if it catches up.
You cannot even hope to comprehend what my eyes have seen, little girl. Beneath my gaze, empires have prospered and warred. I have watched men uncover the fabric of time, and I have seen them burn libraries. My eyes have gazed upon every facet of humanity, but what they have not seen, what they crave to see, is its utter destruction.
Wait, I say, ignoring another message from Matt. You want to destroy humanity because you're bored? Oh, that's pretty dumb, dude.
Do not question me, little girl. I am the 100-eyed God. My power knows no limits, and neither does my rage. Insult my intelligence again, and you shall feel my wrath.
The eyeballs shake with rage. I clearly struck a nerve. Oh yeah? You can't do shit to me, I say with a newfound dose of confidence in my chest. You're just bored and cranky. A frustrated growl comes from the mass of eyeballs. The 100-eyed God hovers impotently in front of me as if he is in the midst of trying to make up his mind about something.
You are right,
he finally says.
While you are under the influence of that filthy magical herb, I cannot harm you. But my followers can.
My numb face is immediately covered with painful scratches. I'm getting dragged out of the bushes by two of the sweaty joggers. They don't look at me as they pull me towards the empty pond, but the rest of the crowd keeps their eyes locked on me. They chant,
He has seen us. He has seen the work. All he needs is a sacrifice of blood. He has seen us. He has seen the work. May his eyes be pleased. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he will arrive.
I am pushed through the crowd towards where the edge of the pond used to be. Among finely picked fish bones, the blob of fish has taken shape. Out of the mud, 100 pink eyes stare back at me. Among those horrible spheres, a toothless mouth yawns to life.
Slit her throats and let her blood flow to me.
The mouth commands.
Once her life fuels mine, the world shall burn.
The jogger next to me produces an axe. It glows in the bright light of the stars. I become intimately aware of the beating of my heart. As the blade travels towards my throbbing neck, I feel the blood travel through my body. I know I'm about to die. My phone vibrates. Have you seen Breaking Bad? I scream at the mass of eyeballs as the cold steel of the axe sends a trickle of blood down to my collarbone. The axe steadies. The 100-eyed God stares at me in confusion.
What?
Breaking Bad. It's like one of the best shows that has ever been on television. It dwells into the question of what it means to be evil and whether we can retain our mortality when doing inhuman things. The 100-eyed God is confused. The axe of the jogger puppet doesn't move from my neck, but it doesn't cut further. I seize my opportunity. Or 6 Feet Under. You can't destroy humanity if you've never seen 6 Feet Under. It's a show about death. You like death, right? The show explores the fragility of human life in the face of death, but celebrates the strength of human spirit when confronted with life-shattering trauma. I gently nudge the jogger's hand away. He doesn't resist. In the last episode, it's like amazing. I don't think I know anyone who watched it and didn't cry.
Where do I find this thing that makes everyone weep?
The 100-eyed God finally asks. It's definitely streaming somewhere on the internet.
What is the internet?
You got so bored you were willing to destroy humanity and you haven't checked out the internet? Dude, that's real. I stop myself. I'm slowly sobering up and learning that maybe pushing my luck with the Eldritch God isn't the best course of action? That's unfortunate. Before madness burns the skies or whatever, you should really check out the internet.
What is the internet?
The blob at the bottom of the pond asks with growing frustration in its voice.
Where do I find this internet?
I take out my phone. There are 37 desperate message notifications from Matt. I push them away. I have the internet on my phone. I yell down into the pond.
You are too far away, little girl. Come closer.
The blob groans. Getting an axe blade pressed into my neck has sobered me up. I'm scared, but my hand-eye coordination has improved considerably. I make my way down through the mud towards the center of the pond. The finely picked fish bones crack under my feet like eggshells. The smell of rot makes me want to dry heave, but I keep my cool. I pull up the trailer for Breaking Bad on YouTube.
He is a man of science, but he also does crime.
The 100-eyed god murmurs to himself. Above the crowd of worshippers stares down at us.
Interesting. Show me more of this internet.
Come on, Liz, talk to me. We're meant for each other.
I put Matt on mute and show the Eldritch God the tubes of the internet. I throw in a couple more series trailers, but when I notice his eyes drifting, I bring out the heavy mind fried guns. I take the 100-eyed God through public freakout forums, through fail compilations, and all the way towards YouTube drama channels. I thank my lucky stars that I charged my phone before I left the house. If I didn't, I probably wouldn't have a head and humanity would be over.
How much more of this is there?
As inhuman as the array of eyeballs is, I see a glint of something familiar. He's tired. After a couple of hours of browsing the internet, the 100-eyed god seems all tuckered out. His followers continue standing at the edge of the pond, expressionless. Oh, on YouTube alone, there's like 300 new hours of videos posted up every minute. The blob of fish flesh bubbles. He's thinking.
I want to see it all.
He finally says, well, you can't destroy humanity and enjoy the internet. Gotta make a choice. He bubbles again, harder this time. Some of those pink fleshy eyeballs pop to make room for his growing mouth.
All of you.
A rumbling voice thunders through the forest.
Go home.
Without a hint of hesitation, the haggard crowd of worshippers turns around and marches back off into the forest. What's going to happen to them? I ask.
They will have some trouble remembering what they did for the past 3 months. Some of them will be confused about their missing fingers.
There isn't a shred of empathy in the 100-eyed god's voice, but for what it's worth, I was expecting a significantly worse outcome.
Give me your internet.
Out of the blob, a stringy tentacle of fish guts emerges and reaches for my phone. I want to send a quick message to Matt to let him know I won't be on my phone, but he beats me to it.
Okay, fine. Don't talk to me, you bitch. I don't care anymore. Goodbye forever.
Problem solved. The guy was always a tool anyways. I placed my phone in the rotting fish tentacle.
Good. Now leave me be. I will watch one more video and then rest.
I don't argue with the Eldritch God. I go home. I can hear my stepdad snoring in the other room. My mom occasionally tries to tuck him back into silence, but she's too tired to put up any real effort. The guy deserves to sleep anyway. He's been through some rough shit over the past 3 months. We all have. We've all gone a bit crazy this quarantine season. Knowing that the world isn't going to end in some demonic bonfire fueled with human insecurity is nice. Being able to trace back some of the obsessive needs for productivity and self-improvement during a global pandemic to the ancient god rather than our own inferiority is pretty cool as well, yeah. But you know what's really dope? You know what is going to make it really easy for me to pass out right now? The stars. They no longer look like giant eyeballs that are waiting in the sky for something horrible to happen. There's a gentle summer wind outside, and the stars look like regular old stars. The 100-eyed god is no longer watching us. He is no longer waiting to bring ruin to civilization or bend mankind to his will. The 100-eyed god is just frying his brain on the internet like the rest of us. Good night. Hope you're safe, sane, and healthy.
The understanding of happiness among humans is rather misguided. They often think that long-term contentment can be found in the eyes of a lover, in the fruits of one's labor, or in the raw passion that seethes from a work of art. Yet spouses die and cheat. What is a dream job becomes unsustainable, or worse, mundane. And even great works of art get buried beneath the creative products of the billions of other souls searching for their own piece of spiritual fulfillment. Sustainable joy isn't a target that is hit and then pays back in perpetuity. It's the feeling, a year from now, on a Wednesday afternoon, where the contentment is just strong enough to stop you from asking the question of whether you're happy to begin with. Pavel Reba was conceived in the confused afterglow of the Second World War. The Nazis had been defeated. Hitler had splattered the walls of his underground bunker with the remnants of his sentience, and Czechoslovakia was a free country once more. Yet, as the clump of cells in Mrs. Reba's womb slowly attained personhood, the country strayed away from the freedom it had fought for. Election results were adapted to a new political reality. Voices which called for democracy were pushed out of windows, and by the time Pavel emerged, screaming into the world, he was living in another state, which bowed down to a cruel foreign master. The Soviets might have used a different nomenclature than the Nazis to justify the suffering that they spread through Europe, yet they were just as willing to sacrifice millions of innocent lives to keep the machinery of their empire running. It was difficult to have a happy childhood when the country was descending into totalitarianism. There were rules, far too many rules for a young boy to follow. There were things he couldn't talk about, things he couldn't ask, dreams he wasn't allowed to dream. It was difficult to understand why his mother would cry when listening to the radio in the evenings, or why his father had broken down when the police wanted to ask about his brother. The young boy lived in a world that would confuse even an adult. As Pavel grew older, however, he slowly started to understand. His parents spoke of show trials, which were used by the communists to execute their political rivals. Family gatherings were filled with hushed whispers of uprisings crushed by tanks. The country in which he was living was choking beneath the boot of totalitarianism, and any cries for help were punished with additional pressure to the neck. Things were steadily growing worse, but things seldom grow worse unopposed. Socialism with a human face is what they called it. If the state was truly the utopia that the government propaganda suggested, then what was the harm in loosening the travel restrictions? In allowing artists to say what was truly on their mind? Wouldn't a perfect society benefit from a free press? Pavel and his university cohorts believed that real structural change was possible. The idealism that festered in the youth bounced joyfully through the cold streets of Prague and brought forth a warm spring drenched in hope and rock and roll. Yet even the most optimistic of smiles falter at the presence of foreign tanks. On the night of August 20th, 1968, 250,000 troops invaded Czechoslovakia under the orders of the Soviet Union. Within hours, the boot of totalitarianism snuffed out the spirit of hope that had been building for months. Even those among the Czechs who had thought of the Soviets as their brethren had to admit that they were not living in a partnership. They were occupied by a superpower that was willing to crush them just to send out a message to the other satellite states. Freedom was not a choice. Some did not accept defeat. Pavel's classmates vowed to fight the system in any way that they could, through letters and charters and smuggling. They would chip away at the power of their oppressors and meddle in their affairs until the time was right to break the chains. Others chose to work within the system, to accept things as they were, and try to pry as much joy out of the life that they were forced to live. They'd join the party, maybe sign some condemnations, let a couple words slip about their neighbors. The system would repay their moral flexibility with perks. If one could gain the trust of the machinery, their kids would have guaranteed university spots. One could travel for vacations. A half-decent life could be provided for those who helped the oppressors. Pavel's friends flowed into the two opposing groups, but he could do neither. He couldn't imagine cooperating with the same people who ran tanks through the borders of his country and hung political opponents. There was no way that he would join the Communist Party. He didn't have the moral flexibility. Yet at the same rate, Pavel couldn't imagine committing to a lifetime of fighting a mammoth enemy that could not be defeated. He was not brave enough to stand up against a system that held all of the cards. He didn't want to throw away his future to make a statement. He didn't want to end up in jail. He didn't want to end up dead. He didn't know what he wanted. Weeks after the invasion, as everyone around him picked their lot in life, Pavel set out on a walk. He didn't have a specific path when he set out, he just let his feet guide him. All that he wanted to do was to get out of his crummy apartment and as far from the nagging question of his future as he could. Pavel walked out of the anxious city, past the construction sites for the new housing projects and into the woods that drizzled the edges of Prague. The forest path was calmer. Being away from the constant ringing of trams and chatter of pedestrians did him good, but his mind was still occupied with worry. The air was cool in the shade of the trees, and unseen birds chirped happily in the distance, but Pavel still worried about the future. All of those thoughts disappeared the moment he saw the reservoir. The structure was man-made, but the only thing that suggested the unnatural touch was a cement shack that housed the water valves. From the moment he saw it, Pavel couldn't think of the reservoir in front of him as anything but a work of nature. To him, it was a pond with shimmering water and swaying reeds and the occasional hint of fish. His worries about the future were gone. There were no barbed wire borders or tanks or human rights violations. The only thing that mattered at that moment, the only thing that truly existed, was that gem of tranquil blue lying in a sea of grass. He sat down at the edge of the pond and let the perfection of the place wash over him like a soothing salve. The fabric of time itself stretched and shrunk at the otherworldly beauty of the pond. Each moment that he spent sitting by the water seemed to drag on into eternity. Yet by the time the sun set, by the time he had to look back and acknowledge that he had spent an entire day in a strange clearing in the woods, it all seemed to have passed in a snap. It was getting dark. He needed to go home. As he stumbled his way back through the blackening wood, Pavel passed an old wooden cottage that was nestled just a stone's throw away from the clearing. By the time he reached Prague's city limits, his mind was made up. He had a calling. That pond had awoken something in him. So much of his life was uncertain. But the one thing Pavel knew was that he would become the owner of that cottage by the pond. After finishing off his studies, Pavel became a ticket inspector on the city's public transport. Pavel's days would be spent shuffling through the miserable rush-hour crowds on the trams, and eventually the subway. The badge that he carried looked more like a piece of scrap metal rather than a seal of authority, but the passengers never complained. In fact, they never talked. He would flash his badge, they would show their tickets, and if they didn't have them, they would present their identification for a fine or run. Pavel never chased the ones that ran. His mind was elsewhere. Whenever one of his colleagues was tasked with inspecting tickets on the bus routes that hugged the edges of the city, Pavel did his best to swap shifts. It was easier for him to get home after work, he told his colleagues. This was a half-truth. Pavel's apartment was deep within the heart of Prague, yet he felt more at home at the pond. As soon as his shift was done, Pavel would walk out through the woods, sit down by the water, and just take in its majestic beauty. After a couple years of saving and greasing palms that disliked the concept of private ownership, Pavel bought the rundown cottage on the edge of the pond. Most of the routes that Pavel had to work involved the newly built subway in the center, or the trams that crossed through the more historical parts of town. But after work, Pavel would always return to his personal slice of heaven. For the better part of 20 years, Pavel spent every spare moment of his life sitting by the edge of the pond, soaking in the tranquility that his little paradise provided. There was no need for family or friends or hobbies. He had his pond, and that was all that mattered. Meanwhile, the people of Czechoslovakia lived through the totalitarian system that was forced upon them. The communists kept an iron grip on the country, but no grip lasts forever. Charters were signed, political prisoners were abused, protests were organized, and before the party could realize what was happening, the entire country turned against it. This time, there would be no tanks. The Soviets were far too preoccupied with the fallout from Afghanistan, with the pressure from the West, with the other satellite states getting similar ideas of freedom. The bloodless revolution started on November 16, 1989, and before the 80s ended, the country was free. The trams and subways and buses that Pavel rode during the days of the uprising were tense with anticipation. When the revolution was over, they were bright with excitement for a new future, and even after freedom had lost its novelty, they still bathed in the afterglow of victory. He was happy. Who wouldn't be? But the burst of joy that he got from seeing the evil system of his childhood defeated paled in the soft, reliable contentment he got from his pond. Pavel celebrated the crumbling of the Soviet Empire by working the transport track for a couple more years and then retiring to his cabin in the woods. Buying a fishing rod was the most radical thing that Pavel did in the first 5 years of retirement. Fishing seemed like the type of thing that men in retirement do, and Pavel wanted to throw in a pinch of normalcy into his pond-focused life. But the main reason why he picked up the hobby was because he was scared of the fish overpopulating and starving. Pavel couldn't let anything happen to the pond. The fish were his friends. They were his only friends. As the 21st century crawled into existence, the edges of the city stretched past the old Soviet housing projects. First came the weekend cyclists, then the adventurous dog owners, and finally, the joggers. Within a couple of years, Pavel's private pond had become a piece of nature that he had to share with the neighborhood. The screaming children were annoying, and the drunks from the barbecues who wanted to talk about fishing were a pain, but Pavel would manage to block them out on most days. His life had become one extended fishing trip. The pond was enthralling enough to let him shut out the outside world. But happiness based on external factors rarely lasts forever. They showed up at his door wearing face masks and offering food. At first he thought they were some sort of Christian sect, but after some explanation they revealed themselves to be volunteers. Did he not wonder why people had stopped coming to the reservoir? Did he not notice the woods being exceptionally quiet? Did he not hear about the pandemic? Pavel didn't. He never got a radio or a television. There was no need for it. Who needed the news when you could just watch the calm ripples of the pond? The volunteers brought Pavel supplies, and would continue to do so over the coming weeks of the pandemic. He was, after all, a senior citizen, who shouldn't be risking his life going on grocery trips. The optimistic volunteers told him that the lockdown would last 2 weeks. The ones who had learned cynicism in their voices said it would last longer. Pavel didn't mind. He had his pond. The term senior citizen did, however, get caught in the back of his head. In Pavel's mind, he was still the same young man who in '68 had stumbled upon a magical place in the woods to escape Soviet tanks. Everything that happened after that point of his life was just one protracted fishing trip, with real-life responsibilities thrown in for a gentle note of conflict. As the quarantine dragged past its 2-week benchmark, however, Pavel started to realize that maybe his years were getting to him. He started hearing voices. It was a gentle rumble in the back of his head at first, but as the days went on, those voices grew louder and louder. Sometimes they cast doubt about his choice to commit his life to the pond. At other times, they poked at the potential loneliness that foregoing family for a life of fishing might bring. But every time, they were direct about what he was meant to do. He was meant to leave the pond. He managed to shut out that foreign internal monologue that bounced around his skull, but from the moment he had first heard those whispers, something had changed about the pond. It seemed different. The door of the concrete shack that held the water valves was kicked off its hinges. Someone had been draining the reservoir. Pavel put everything back in its place, chalked up the loosened valves to teenagers bored in lockdown, and went back to enjoy his pond. The voices didn't like him doing that. They howled and ordered him to leave the pond. They spoke of 100-eyed God. But Pavel chose to ignore them. He had lived long enough to get good at ignoring things, yet the situation quickly deteriorated. Soon, he wasn't alone. Joggers started running around his pond much like they did before the pandemic, but these joggers were not the usual peppy people with Fitbits and toned bodies. The joggers that ran around his pond were exhausted shells of people, drenched in sweat. They were all far too out of shape to be going on regular runs that deep into the woods, yet they pushed their bodies past their breaking points. They ran around the pond, they ran into the forest, they emerged with weighed-down plastic bags as the wheezing joggers ran across the meadow. Pavel tried to ignore them and keep his eyes on the water. But he couldn't ignore them. The water from the reservoir was being drained again. When Pavel came back to the concrete shack, all thought of the water being drained by harmless teens dissipated. The culprit stood right by the valves, one of the sunken-eyed joggers. Pavel tried to reason with him, to ask him why he would want to drain the beautiful pond and harm all the innocent fish that lived within, but the jogger wouldn't listen. He only spoke of 100-eyed God. He wanted Pavel to leave the pond. The voices in Pavel's head echoed the sentiment. They thundered with a power that whisked away any chance of them being simple senility or neuroticism. The jogger became violent. The paramedics found him at the gate to one of the new suburban developments near the forest. Unconscious, covered in mud and bleeding from the head, the dog walker who called the ambulance feared the worst. Yet after being inspected at the hospital, Pavel's head trauma proved to be a simple scrape. The man was in remarkably good shape for his years. The hospital kept him overnight for closer observation, but the doctor told Pavel he didn't have to worry about any long-lasting trauma. He barely heard her. Pavel was too busy thinking about the pond. He knew something was wrong. Somewhere in the depths of his soul, he knew something had happened with the pond. Outside, the stars shone like 1,000 shapeless eyes, and the air was thick with tension. Whatever had wanted out of the pond was a force beyond Pavel's comprehension. After hours of watching the night sky, trying to understand what had happened over the past couple of weeks, Pavel decided to go to sleep. Maybe there was a rational explanation for everything. Maybe the pond was okay. Maybe he was simply going mad. He was set to leave the hospital the next day. The sooner he slept, the sooner he would get closure. He didn't. It was a horrid series of visions. His pond was gone. In its place was a muddy crater filled with dead fish. A crowd gathered around the corpse of his love, with hollow expressions stared down into the hole and chanted, "He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he shall walk the earth. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon his eyes shall judge our souls. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he will arrive." The fish started to flop. Their scales rhythmically rose and fell as if they were grasping for breath, as if they were coming back to life. But they weren't. Their scales ripped apart to free their soft pink flesh. Strings of fish guts all moved towards the center of the pond and amassed themselves into... His heartbeat was deafening. Pavel awoke in the middle of a dark hospital room in a cold sweat. He scarcely understood where he was, but he knew two things. His pond was gone, and he was having a heart attack. Pavel was lucky he was already in the hospital. Pavel wasn't as fortuitous with the heart attack as he was with head trauma. He was lucky enough to survive, but even after a week of being kept in the hospital, he felt like most of his energy had been sapped away from him. Suddenly, he wasn't just a continuation of that young man who'd stumbled into a hidden paradise during an invasion. Now he was an old man nearing his final days. The old man hobbled onto a bus and rode out to the edge of the city. The ticket checker didn't ask for his ticket. Pavel looked like a feeble centenarian, and people over 70 rode for free. He shuffled his feet through the dark forest path that led to his meadow. Pavel kept on hoping that the horrible vision he had was simply a product of a colorful imagination, or a precursor to his heart problems. But he failed to convince himself. The day was cloudy, and there was very little light at the end of the tunnel of trees. He knew something horrible happened that night. He wept. For the first time since the arrival of the Soviet tanks, Pavel wept. Everything that had made him happy in his life was gone. The air of tranquility, that intoxicating aroma of the woods. It was all gone. In its stead was mud and the smell of rot. The bottom of the reservoir was filled with the same blank-eyed fishbone he had seen in his dream. Yet among them was something shiny. Even in his grief-stricken state, it caught his eye. Among the finely picked corpses of his animal friends, there was a smartphone. A voice cut through his grief.
You should check on that phone,
it said. The voice sounded familiar. It was the same voice he had heard in his mind during the early days of the lockdown. But there was something different about it. It was weak. It was diminished in some primal way.
You should check on that phone,
the voice repeated. Pavel found himself walking to the edge of the pond. He tried to carefully descend the slope, but his shaky legs were no match for the mud. He fell, he bounced, something cracked. Pain. He lay there on a jagged pile of fish bones, grasping for breaths that wouldn't come. The grey skies above him were nothing like the pale blue of his youth. It started to rain. His heart started to ache again. Yet before he could fully explore the possibility of another heart attack, something else grabbed Pavel's attention. The corner of his mouth. Something was trying to crawl past his lips. It reeked of rotten fish. He tore at the mysterious creature, did whatever he could to keep it from crawling into his mouth, yet its soft, fleshy tentacles slipped past his fingers like Play-Doh. The old man shook with panic. Everything he had cared about was gone. He was dying, and now there was something trying to crawl into his mouth that tasted like rancid Chinese food. His heart was filled with pain and fear, yet it all ended in an instant. A wave of calm swept through the old man. A familiar calm. As soon as the tentacles had made it past a certain point of his throat, it was as if Pavel was reborn. The rave of tranquility was the same one that the reservoir had provided. But where the pond rippled, the rotten fish created a tsunami. As the 100-eyed god took control of Pavel's body, his mind was drenched in a serene peace. He doesn't go out much now. The pond is a bone-filled husk of what it used to be. and all the stomping joggers of the quarantine have killed off any semblance of plant life. Pavel simply sits in his cottage and browses the internet on the smartphone he found at the bottom of the pond. There is just so much Golden Age television and Reddit posts and YouTube series about crime-fighting dinosaurs that he is yet to consume. That the 100-eyed god is to consume, that is. Pavel has become an eldritch finger puppet for a force more powerful than he could ever comprehend. The 100-eyed god needed a vessel with thumbs to let him browse the internet, and Pavel had thumbs. Not like he had a lot going on anyway. But Pavel is being repaid for his service to the 100-eyed god. From the depths of his stomach he is being fed pure, long-lasting happiness. His pond might be gone, but happiness gained from external things rarely lasts. Happiness comes from inside. Some say that he still sits at his cottage until this very day. The old man just sits there, scrolling and streaming and reading and watching, all in the service of the 100-eyed god.
The 100-Eyed God was written and produced by me, Mike Jesus Langer, and has featured the voices of Sam Barlien, Jenn Kirk, Grax Bishop, Dr. Creepin, Nikolai Shevchik, Alyssa Dillard, and Steffi Wright. Music by Petar Mrdjen, The Dark Side of Music, and Frederick Chopin, with art by Teresa Kolachikova. The series might be over, but there's still going to be oodles of spooky stuff coming to their channel. Stay tuned for new stories every Tuesday and Friday, and maybe, just maybe, you might find out what Pavel Ryba is up to these days. Thank you for listening, hope you're doing well, and I'm looking forward to bringing you more fever dreams in the near future.